The Consort of Liberty, the political life of Abigail Adams. History remembers the plea, "Remember the ladies." But behind that famous sentence was a woman who was never content to simply be remembered. She insisted on being heard. From a quiet library in Weymouth to the glittering, dangerous courts of Paris and London, Abigail Adams was more than a witness to the American Revolution. She was its silent general, its financial strategist, and its most honest critic. This is the story of a self-educated pioneer who managed a wartime farm, navigated the birth of a presidency, and forged an intellectual partnership that would change the course of a nation. Step into the 18th century as you've never seen it before, through the eyes of the woman who held the Republic together when its foundations were most at risk. Chapter 1: The Weymouth Library, 1744 to 1762. The year is 1744, and in the small coastal town of Weymouth, Massachusetts, a child is born into a world that does not yet know what to make of her. Her name is Abigail Smith. She is the second daughter of Reverend William Smith and Elizabeth Quincy Smith, and from her very first breath, she enters a household shaped by two powerful currents: the quiet devotion of Puritan faith and the sharp, restless energy of intellectual ambition. These two forces will spend the rest of her life pulling at her in equal measure, and she will, in time, learn not to choose between them but to hold both at once. The Weymouth of Abigail's childhood is a place of salt air and long winters, of church bells and candlelight, of neighbors who know one another's business and preachers who know one another's sins. The Smith family home sits at the center of this world, both literally and socially. Reverend William Smith is a Congregationalist minister, a man of learning and quiet authority, respected throughout the community not only for his faith but for his mind. He believes in books. He believes in conversation. And somewhat unusually for his time, he believes that his daughters deserve access to both. Elizabeth Quincy Smith, Abigail's mother, is a woman of formidable stock. The Quincy family is one of the most prominent in Massachusetts, a name that carries weight in courtrooms and drawing rooms alike. Elizabeth herself is elegant, exacting, and deeply concerned with the proper order of things. She is not unkind, but she is not soft either. She holds her household to a standard, and her children understand almost from the time they can walk that bearing and conduct are not optional. They are the currency of respectability, and respectability in colonial New England is everything. Into this world, Abigail arrives small and frequently ill. She is a sickly child, prone to fevers and chest ailments that keep her home while other children attend the village schoolhouse. This is, by the standards of her time, a misfortune. But it will become, in the quiet arithmetic of history, one of the most important accidents of her formation. Because Abigail does not go to school, she goes to the library instead. Her father's study is a room of wonders. The shelves are lined with volumes that most women of her era will never touch: theology and philosophy, history and poetry, political theory and classical literature. Abigail is given free rein. She reads not as a student completing an assignment, but as a hungry mind consuming everything within reach. She reads Milton and Pope, Shakespeare and Molière. She reads widely, deeply, and without anyone telling her what to think about what she finds. And in that freedom, something remarkable takes root. She develops opinions. This may sound modest, but in the world of 18th century colonial America, a young woman with opinions, strong ones, expressed clearly and without apology, is not merely unusual. She is, to many, a puzzle. Women of Abigail's class and time are educated in the domestic arts: cooking, sewing, household management, perhaps a little French if the family is fashionable enough. They are not, as a rule, expected to have views on Locke or the nature of civil government. They are expected to manage households, raise children, and support the men in their lives with quiet, steady grace. Abigail will do all of those things. But she will do them alongside an interior life of remarkable depth and complexity, and she will not keep that interior life entirely to herself. She is close as a child to her grandmother, Elizabeth Quincy, who lives nearby and who is cut from unusually bold cloth. The grandmother is witty and warm, and possessed of a spirit that refuses to be diminished by the conventions of the age. She delights in Abigail's curiosity, encourages her questions, and offers her something that no book on the shelf quite provides: the living example of a woman who thinks for herself and is not afraid to say so. Abigail will remember her grandmother all her life with a tenderness that suggests the debt was not a small one. She is also close to her sister Mary, 2 years her elder, steady and sensible, and to her younger sister Elizabeth, known as Betsy, who is more spirited and mischievous. The three sisters form a small, tight world of their own within the larger world of the Smith household. They share rooms and confidences, and the particular closeness that belongs to girls who understand that their lives, whatever form they take, will largely be shaped by forces outside their control. Marriage will decide much. The man chosen, or the man who chooses, will determine the geography of their days, the size of their world, the degree to which their inner lives will be permitted expression. It is with this awareness, perhaps, that Abigail Smith approaches the question of love with something more than romance. She is alert instinctively to character. She is interested not only in whether a young man is pleasing to look at or agreeable in company, but in whether he is, in the deepest sense, worth talking to. Whether he will listen. Whether he will engage her as an equal, at least in the private world of their own conversation, even if the public world refuses to allow it. She is 15 years old when she first encounters John Adams. He is 24, a young lawyer from nearby Braintree, a man of no great fortune but considerable ambition, compact and intense, with a mind that moves quickly and an ego that moves at times even more quickly. He comes to the Smith household initially to visit a friend, and he does not, by his own account, think much of Abigail at first. He finds the Smith girls reserved. He is not immediately taken. But John Adams is a man who changes his mind. And Abigail Smith is a person who rewards a second look. The courtship that slowly unfolds between them is not the breathless affair of novels. It is something quieter and stranger, and finally more durable. It is a courtship of minds. They begin to write to each other, long, elaborate, playful letters that dance with literary allusion and gentle argument. They tease one another. They challenge one another. They adopt romantic pen names, as was the custom of the time. He calls her Diana, goddess of the hunt, cool and self-possessed. She calls him Lysander, the Spartan general who wins not by brute force but by cunning and strategy. There is something deeply revealing in the names they choose. They see each other clearly, and they like what they see. Her parents are not entirely sure what to make of John Adams. He is smart, certainly, and her father respects him. But he is not a man of wealth or distinguished family. He is a lawyer only just beginning to make his way, and the path ahead of him is uncertain. Elizabeth Smith, in particular, has reservations. She has raised her daughters with an eye toward the kind of match that will secure their future, and John Adams, earnest, argumentative, volcanic in his enthusiasms, is not precisely the settled prospect she had in mind. But Abigail is not looking for settled. She is looking for equal. And in John Adams, for all his faults, and she is not unaware of his faults, she finds something close enough to equal to make everything else secondary. They become engaged. And it is in the letters of this period, the letters of a young woman on the threshold of a life she cannot yet fully imagine, that the voice of Abigail Adams first fully emerges. Sharp, warm, searching, playful, and already, even now, possessed of a clarity about the world and its injustices that will only deepen with time. She writes to him about books. She writes about the neighbors. She writes about the weather in Weymouth with a precision that is almost comic, and a warmth that is entirely real. But she also writes, even in these early tentative letters, about ideas. About what it means to be a woman in a world that does not grant women very much. About the strange bargain of marriage, which gives and takes in measures that are not always equal. She writes these things lightly, often with humor, but they are not light matters and she knows it. The wedding takes place on the 25th of October, 1764. Abigail Smith is 19 years old. John Adams is 28. The ceremony is performed by her father, Reverend Smith, in the Weymouth church where Abigail has spent her Sundays all her life. It is a modest occasion, befitting a modest beginning. There is no great inheritance changing hands, no grand alliance being sealed. There is only a young woman and a young man standing before God and their families, making the promises that people have always made, not knowing, as no one ever knows, what those promises will be asked to bear. They move to Braintree, to the Adams family farmhouse, a place of plain New England simplicity, practical and unpretentious. Abigail, the minister's daughter, the girl who grew up among books and prayers and the careful rituals of a Congregationalist household, now becomes a farmer's wife. She learns to manage a household with very little. She learns to stretch resources, to plan carefully, to make decisions that in a wealthier home would have been delegated to servants. She is not resentful of this. She is, if anything, interested in it, curious about her own capacity, testing herself against the demands of her new life with something very like determination. And she continues through all of it to read, and to write, and to think. The world outside the farmhouse in Braintree is beginning in these years of the early 1760s to shift in ways that no one quite has words for yet. There is a tension in the colonies, a gathering argument between the people of Massachusetts and the government in London about the nature of liberty, the right of taxation, the question of who finally gets to decide how a free people shall be governed. These are not abstract questions, not to the men who argue them in taverns and courthouses, and not to Abigail Adams, who listens and reads and begins quietly to form her own positions. She is not supposed to have positions on these matters. She is supposed to have dinner ready, and children tended, and the farmhouse running when her husband comes home. And she does all of these things. But behind it, always the mind is working. The opinions are forming. And the voice that will one day speak, clearly, powerfully, in letters that her husband will keep and that history will eventually read, is finding its register, testing its range, learning what it is capable of. The girl from Weymouth is becoming someone. She does not yet know exactly who. But the world is about to give her plenty of material to work with. The argument gathering in the colonies will become a revolution. The revolution will call her husband away. And in the distance that opens between them, the years of absence, the danger, the loneliness, the extraordinary weight of holding a life and a family and a farm together while history is being made somewhere else, Abigail Adams will discover the full extent of what she is. She is not merely a minister's daughter or a farmer's wife or the helpmate of a great man. She is, in her own right, one of the most formidable minds of her generation. And the story of how that mind made its way into the world, against every obstacle that the world placed in front of it, is the story we are here to tell. It begins in Weymouth, in the salt air and the candlelight, with a small sickly girl who was given a library instead of a schoolhouse, and who made of that accident something extraordinary. Chapter 2, The Courtship of Equals, 1762 to 1774. There is a particular kind of love that does not announce itself all at once. It does not arrive in a single, decisive moment, no thunderclap, no sudden certainty. It arrives instead the way a season changes, gradually, almost imperceptibly, through a succession of small moments that only later, looking back, reveal themselves as the turning points they always were. This is the kind of love that Abigail Smith and John Adams find their way toward. And it is, in its quiet, deliberate unfolding, one of the most remarkable partnerships in the history of a nation not yet born. The year is 1762, and Abigail is 17. John Adams is 26, freshly admitted to the Massachusetts bar, restless with ambition and alive with the particular nervous energy of a man who knows he is capable of something large but has not yet determined exactly what. He rides out to Weymouth not in pursuit of Abigail but in company with his friend Richard Cranch, who is courting her elder sister Mary. He comes, in other words, as an afterthought, a polite addition to someone else's errand, and he behaves accordingly. He is pleasant, he is sociable, and he pays no particular attention to the younger Smith girl sitting quietly nearby with her book and her watchful eyes. He will later admit in his diary that he found the Smith daughters stiff, reserved. He was not charmed. He records this with the brutal self-honesty that characterizes his private writing throughout his life, that willingness to document his own errors of perception that distinguishes a truly honest man from merely an articulate one. He was wrong about Abigail Smith. He writes that down too, eventually, and he does not minimize the magnitude of the mistake. What changes his mind is conversation. Because when John Adams returns to Weymouth, and he does return again and again in the company of Cranch, he discovers that the quiet girl with the book has something to say. About everything. About poetry and theology, about the latest pamphlet circulating through Boston, about the character of their neighbors and the nature of virtue, and the troubling question of what exactly a just government owes its citizens. She says these things not with the desperate eagerness of someone who has been waiting to be noticed, but with the easy confidence of someone who has simply always thought this way, and assumed until now that other people might find it tiresome. John Adams does not find it tiresome. He finds it electrifying. And so it begins, not with roses or moonlight, though there is enough of both in the Massachusetts countryside, but with argument. With the back and forth of two minds discovering that they are in some fundamental way matched. Not identical, they are never identical. John is volcanic where Abigail is measured. He is given to grand declarations, and sudden enthusiasms and equally sudden despairs. She is steadier, more ironic, more willing to sit with a difficult thought rather than immediately resolving it into certainty. He moves in great forward surges. She maintains her ground. Together, they make something that neither of them could quite make alone, a conversation that neither of them wants to stop. By 1763, the conversation has moved to paper. John has returned to Braintree to practice law, which means that the distance between them, not great, perhaps 15 miles, is sufficient to require letters. And it is in letters that they truly find each other. The correspondence that begins in these early years, and will continue with varying intensity for more than half a century, is one of the great epistolary archives of American history. But in 1763, it is simply two young people writing to each other with the particular ardor of those who have discovered, to their considerable surprise, that someone else in the world thinks the way they do. They are playful in these early letters. Teasing even. John writes to her as Diana, the Roman goddess of the moon and the hunt, cool, self-sufficient, unreachable. She receives the name with characteristic irony, aware of its flattery and its implication both. She names him Lysander after the Spartan admiral, a man of tactical brilliance who wins not through strength alone but through patience and cunning. These are not idle choices. They understand each other well enough already to know which mythologies fit. She teases him about his vanity, which is considerable. He teases her about her penmanship, which is imperfect. She acknowledges this cheerfully and does not improve it, as if to make clear from the beginning that she is not going to become someone different simply because someone she admires is watching. He loves this about her. He will say so repeatedly across the years, in ways that make clear he has understood what a rare thing it is, a person who will not perform for you. A person who is simply, stubbornly, entirely themselves. She writes to him in the winter of 1763, with a kind of charged playfulness that barely disguises the seriousness beneath it. She quotes Milton. She discusses a sermon she has heard. She describes the frozen landscape of Weymouth with the close attention of someone who has spent a great deal of time looking at things carefully. And then she pivots, with the graceful, almost effortless transition that will become her epistolary signature, into something much larger. A question about the nature of happiness, about whether contentment is something one finds or something one constructs, and what role another person can reasonably play in that construction without becoming a crutch instead of a companion. She is 18 years old when she writes this. Let that settle for a moment. John Adams reads it in his rooms in Braintree and falls the rest of the way in love. Elizabeth Smith, Abigail's mother, maintains her reservations. John Adams is not the match she would have chosen. He is the son of a farmer, however educated, however promising. He has debts, as young lawyers invariably do. He has a temper that is not always kept in check, and an appetite for political argument that strikes Elizabeth as impractical at best and dangerous at worst. She is not wrong about any of this. But she is watching the wrong variables. She is calculating the known quantities, wealth, family name, social position, and missing the one quality that will make this marriage not merely survivable but genuinely remarkable, the fact that John Adams, for all his faults, is a man who finds Abigail Smith's mind as compelling as anything else about her, and who has enough intelligence to know what that means. Reverend Smith is more easily persuaded. He and John share an intellectual temperament, a love of ideas and debate, and the older man can see clearly enough what his younger daughter has found. He gives his blessing without great difficulty. Elizabeth yields, as she always does when outnumbered by people she loves. The engagement is settled by late 1763. The wedding, as noted, will wait until the autumn of 1764, and in the interval the letters continue, longer now, more confident, more willing to venture into deeper waters. Abigail begins to write to John about the things that trouble her, not with the expectation that he will fix them, but with the understanding that he will take them seriously. She writes about the education of women, or rather the lack of it, the systematic way in which girls are kept from the knowledge that would allow them to think independently, and the circular logic by which their resultant ignorance is then used as evidence that they are not capable of independent thought. She writes about this with a controlled anger that is all the more powerful for being controlled. John does not disagree with her. This is one of the things she will always be grateful for, and one of the things she will always find slightly maddening, because he agrees with her in theory, often eloquently, while doing rather less than he might in practice. It is a dynamic that will define their marriage. She sees clearly, states plainly, and is largely right. He acknowledges she is right, expresses admiration for her clarity, and then goes back to operating in the world as it is rather than as it ought to be. She learns to find this less an act of hypocrisy than an act of human nature. She does not excuse it, but she understands it. On the 25th of October 1764, in the church where she has worshipped all her life, Abigail Smith becomes Abigail Adams. She is 19. He is 28. Her father reads the service with the careful solemnity of a man who knows the weight of what he is doing. The congregation of Weymouth watches. The autumn light falls through the church windows in long slanted columns, the way light does in New England in October, golden and slightly elegiac, as if the season itself understands that something is passing. They move to Braintree, to the small farmhouse on the Adams family property that John has inherited from his father, a plain, practical structure that makes no claims to grandeur. Abigail looks at it and begins, immediately and without sentimentality, to figure out how to make it work. She is a minister's daughter, remember? She has grown up in a household of some standing with household help, with a mother who managed domestic life with exacting precision, but who did not manage it alone. Here in Braintree, the resources are thinner and the labor more demanding. The farm must be maintained. The animals must be tended. The food must be grown and preserved and stretched across months when nothing new can be added to it. And John, increasingly drawn into the practice of law, is away more than he is present, riding the circuit of courts across Massachusetts, building the reputation that will eventually make him indispensable to the colonial cause. Abigail learns to be alone. This is perhaps the most underappreciated skill of her life, and it is one she learns early and under duress. She learns to make decisions without consultation, to solve problems without assistance, to carry the full weight of a household on shoulders that are, by her own description, not always strong. She is still prone to illness, still susceptible to the fevers and respiratory ailments that plagued her childhood, and she manages them as she manages everything, with a minimum of complaint and a great deal of quiet persistence. Their first child arrives in July of 1765. A daughter named Abigail and called Nabby by the family, a small dark-eyed girl who will grow up watching her mother think. The birth is difficult, and the recovery is slow, and Abigail conducts all of it largely without John, who is away on court business, and returns to find his wife and daughter already established in the rhythms of their new arrangement. He is tender and attentive when he is present. When he is absent, which is often, Abigail writes him letters that manage simultaneously to describe the texture of daily life in Braintree and to maintain, undiminished, the intellectual engagement that has always been the truest core of their connection. John Quincy Adams arrives in July of 1767, the second child and first son, a boy of such evident intelligence and such relentless curiosity that he will eventually exhaust even his famously energetic father. Abigail recognizes something of herself in him, the voracious reading, the early gravity, the way he watches the world with an attention that seems almost unfair in someone so small. She begins, almost from the moment he can listen, to educate him. Not formally, there are no lesson plans, no prescribed texts, but continuously, in the way that a person who cannot stop thinking inevitably educates the people around them, by treating every meal and every walk and every question as an opportunity to understand something more about the world. Susanna arrives in 1768, a delicate child who will live only 14 months before succumbing to one of those swift colonial illnesses that claim so many infants, and that leave in their wake a grief that those who have not experienced it cannot fully imagine. Abigail does not write extensively about Susanna's death in her surviving letters. What she does write is careful and brief, the writing of someone who has decided that the only way forward is forward, and that dwelling, however natural, is something she cannot afford. But the brevity does not indicate absence of feeling. Anyone who reads Abigail Adams carefully learns that what she does not say is often as significant as what she does. Charles comes in 1770, and Thomas in 1772, and with 5 children, 4 living, Abigail Adams is running a farm, managing a household, raising a family of remarkable individuals, and continuing through all of it to engage with the world beyond the farmhouse door with the same alert, probing intelligence she brought to her father's library as a small girl in Weymouth. She is not isolated from that world. She cannot be; it is coming to her whether she wishes it or not. The 1760s in Massachusetts are years of gathering storm. The Stamp Act of 1765 ignites the colonies in a fury of protest that reaches even quiet Braintree. John Adams writes against it, publicly and with considerable skill, and Abigail follows every development with an attention that goes far beyond wifely interest in a husband's career. She has opinions. She has, in fact, been forming opinions about the relationship between the colonies and the Crown for some time, and the Stamp Act gives those opinions a specific and urgent focus. She reads the pamphlets. She discusses them with John. She writes about them to her friends and to her sister Mary, who has married Richard Cranch, and whose house provides one of Abigail's most important intellectual outlets, a place where ideas can be tested against another woman's mind. She follows the Boston Massacre of 1770 with horror, and with something that is not quite surprise. She has understood for some time that the tension building in Massachusetts cannot be relieved without either genuine concession on the part of the Crown, or the kind of confrontation that no one wants to fully imagine. She is not naive about violence. She is not naive about anything. But she hopes, as reasonable people do, for a path that avoids the worst. The events of King Street in March of 1770, where British soldiers fire into a crowd and 5 colonists die, suggests that the worst has drawn rather closer than hope had allowed for. John defends the soldiers. This is one of the most discussed decisions of his early career, the willingness, in the face of enormous public outrage, to provide legal representation to the men who fired the shots. He does it because he believes, with a lawyer's unromantic conviction, that every accused person deserves a defense, and that the principle of fair trial is more important than the popularity of any individual case. He is acquitted of opportunism by history, and rightly so. But in 1770, in Braintree, the decision is not without cost to his reputation, and Abigail must navigate the social consequences in the daily life of the town while John navigates the legal ones in the courtroom. She is steady. She is always steady in the ways that matter, which is not the same as being without feeling. She writes to John, he is in Boston for the trial, she is in Braintree with the children. And her letters during this period have a quality of compressed intensity, as if she is managing a great deal of emotion by organizing it very carefully into sentences. She supports him. She tells him so. She also tells him, with characteristic precision, exactly what the neighbors are saying, so that he will not return under any illusions about the landscape he is returning to. By the early 1770s, the household in Braintree has found a kind of rhythm. It is not an easy rhythm. It never is, when resources are limited and a husband is frequently absent, and the political situation outside the door grows more volatile by the season. But it is a rhythm nonetheless, sustained by Abigail's extraordinary capacity for management, her refusal to be defeated by difficulty, and the continuing thread of letters between husband and wife that keeps their partnership alive across whatever distance separates them. She is managing not merely a household, but a relationship with a man who is increasingly important to the political life of his colony, and who will soon be asked to sacrifice whatever private peace the family has built for the larger demands of a cause that neither of them has chosen exactly so much as been chosen by. She understands this. She has understood it with increasing clarity for years. She does not resist it. She believes in the cause, genuinely, with the conviction of someone who has thought about it at length and arrived at her position through reason rather than sentiment. But she will have terms. Not the terms of a subordinate negotiating from weakness, but the terms of an equal establishing the conditions under which she will give what is being asked. She will give John her support, her management of everything he cannot manage while he is away, her unflinching candor and her love, which is real and deep and not diminished by the fact that she sees him clearly. In return, she will be heard. She will not be merely managed or placated or politely set aside. She will be listened to, engaged with, taken seriously in the private world of their own exchange, even when the public world continues to insist on her invisibility. This is the bargain. John understands it, though neither of them has ever put it in precisely these terms. He understands it because Abigail has made it impossible not to understand, not through ultimatum, but through the steady pressure of her presence, the quality of her mind, and the unmistakable way in which she makes it clear, letter by letter and year by year, that she is not supporting the revolution from the sidelines. She is in it. She has always been in it. The storm that has been gathering across Abigail's entire adult life is now, in the winter of 1773 and into 1774, almost ready to break. The Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, that great defiant act of colonial theater, electrifies the colonies and enrages the Crown. The British response, the coercive acts of 1774, closes Boston Harbor and strips Massachusetts of much of its self-governance. John Adams is selected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, to meet in Philadelphia in September of 1774. He will go. Of course he will go. The question is not whether John Adams will answer when history calls. The question, the one that Abigail turns over in the quiet of the Braintree farmhouse with 4 children around her and a farm to run, and a world coming apart at its seams, is what it will mean for him to go. She knows the answer. She has always known the answer, in the way that people who think carefully about the future understand it before it arrives. It will mean that she will be alone. It will mean responsibility without assistance and danger without protection, and a loneliness so particular and so deep that only the letters moving back and forth across the distance between them will make it bearable. She accepts this. Not passively, she accepts it the way Abigail Adams accepts everything, which is to say, with full awareness of its cost, with a grief she does not conceal from John, though she carefully controls the degree to which she dwells on it, and with the steady, unyielding conviction that the cause is worth it. That what is being built in those meeting rooms in Philadelphia, whatever it turns out to be, is worth the sacrifice of her comfort, her security, her husband's company, and possibly, God forbid, much more than that. She is 30 years old in 1774. She has been married for 10 years. She has buried a child, and raised 4 others, and managed a farm and followed the most consequential political events of her age, with the attention of someone who understands that history is not something that happens to other people. She has written thousands of words to the man she married, words of love and argument and wit, and sorrow and political analysis and plain domestic inventory, and in those words, she has become, without perhaps fully realizing it, someone whose voice will matter beyond the boundaries of the Braintree farm and the private archive of an extraordinary marriage. The girl from Weymouth who was given a library instead of a schoolhouse, who chose a partner for his mind before his prospects, who learned to run a farm and raise a statesman's children, and keep her own counsel through a decade of difficulty, that girl is now a woman standing on the edge of something enormous. The revolution is coming. And Abigail Adams is ready. Chapter 3, Domestic Command, 1774 to 1776. There is a particular silence that settles over a house when someone essential to it has gone. It is not the ordinary silence of an empty afternoon or a quiet evening. It is something more total than that, more structural, as if the house itself has registered the absence and reorganized around it, leaving a shape where a person used to be. Abigail Adams knows this silence well. She will know it across the coming years, better than she has ever known anything. John leaves for Philadelphia in August of 1774, riding south with 3 other Massachusetts delegates toward the First Continental Congress, toward the rooms where the argument that has been building for a decade will finally be given its most formal and consequential shape. He rides away on a bright summer morning, and Abigail watches him go with the composed face of a woman who has decided in advance that composure is what the moment requires. The children are nearby. The farm stretches out behind her. The road to Philadelphia is very long. She goes inside. She picks up her pen. She begins to write. This is who Abigail Adams is in the late summer of 1774, and this is what she does, not as a coping mechanism, not as a way of filling the silence, but as an act of genuine engagement with the world she inhabits and the man she has sent into it. The letters she writes to John during his absences are not the letters of a woman waiting. They are the letters of a woman working to maintain the farm and the household and the children, yes, but also working to think through the political crisis unfolding around her, to observe and analyze and report, and to make certain that John Adams, seated in his Philadelphia chamber among the most formidable men of the age, does not lose touch with what is happening in Massachusetts, where the consequences of every congressional decision will be felt in the most immediate and personal terms. She is, in this sense, his intelligence. Not his only intelligence. He has colleagues, correspondents, the debates of the Congress itself to inform him. But she is something none of those sources can be, the ground-level view from a woman who lives among the people, who hears their conversations at the market and after church, who understands the texture of daily life in a colony on the verge of something that no one yet has a precise name for. She writes to him about what the neighbors are saying, about the mood in Weymouth and Braintree, about the state of the roads and the price of goods, and the quiet gathering fear that sits beneath the surface of ordinary colonial life like water under ice. She also writes to him about the farm. This is not incidental. This is urgent. Because the farm, the small demanding piece of land in Braintree on which the Adams family's material survival depends, is now entirely her responsibility. John has gone to Philadelphia without being able to arrange for reliable hired help. The timing of harvests does not accommodate itself to the schedules of continental congresses, and the animals require attention regardless of the political situation. Abigail, who has been managing the household for a decade, now takes on the full management of the land itself. She learns what she does not already know. She asks questions of the neighbors, studies the crops, makes decisions about planting and livestock that John under ordinary circumstances would have made himself. She is not a woman who has been trained for this. But she is a woman who has spent her life learning things she was not trained for, and she approaches the farm with the same methodical intelligence she brings to everything else. She reads. She observes. She makes mistakes, acknowledges them, and corrects course. By the end of the first season, she is managing the Braintree property with a competence that surprises even those who know her well, and that she herself describes in her letters with a dry, self-aware humor that never quite conceals the effort beneath it. She writes to John in the autumn of 1774 about the shortage of grain, about the difficulty of finding reliable workers, about the particular challenge of managing men who are accustomed to taking direction from other men and who must now take it from a woman half their age or younger. She handles this with tact and with the quiet authority of someone who knows that authority, in the end, is about competence rather than convention. She is competent. The men figured this out. The work gets done. Meanwhile, the world outside the farmhouse is moving with terrifying speed. The First Continental Congress concludes in October of 1774, having produced a Declaration of Colonial Rights and a plan for economic resistance, but not yet the decisive rupture that many can see coming and that most are still hoping to avoid. John returns to Braintree briefly, thinner and more intense, full of the conversations that have taken place in Philadelphia, full of names and arguments and the particular electric quality of a man who has been in the same room as history and found that he belongs there. Abigail listens. She asks questions. She has already formed views on most of what he describes, based on the pamphlets and newspapers she has been reading with the devotion of someone who understands that information in a time of crisis is a form of preparation. The winter of 1774 into 1775 is a winter of waiting. Everyone in Massachusetts understands that something is coming. The British troops under General Gage have occupied Boston with an authority that grows more brittle by the week. The colonial militias are drilling on village greens across the countryside, and the drilling is no longer theoretical. Weapons are being stockpiled. Plans are being made. In the farmhouse in Braintree, Abigail Adams reads the news, writes her letters, manages her children, and thinks about what is coming with the clear, unillusioned attention of someone who does not look away from difficult truths. April the 19th, 1775, is a day that Abigail will remember for the rest of her life with the precision of someone who is standing close enough to history to feel its heat. The battles at Lexington and Concord, the shots fired in the early morning dark, the British regulars marching out from Boston, the colonial militiamen gathering on the village greens with the resolve of people who have finally decided that the time for deciding is over. These events reach Braintree, not as distant news, but as something proximate and immediate. The roads fill with people. Refugees from the fighting pour through the countryside. The sound of cannon, distant but unmistakable, carries on the April air. Abigail writes to John within hours. Her letter is one of the most remarkable documents she will ever produce. Remarkable not for hysteria, which is absent, but for the quality of attention she brings to the scene unfolding around her. She describes what she sees and hears with the precision of a correspondent, the emotional honesty of a woman who is genuinely frightened and refuses to pretend otherwise, and the analytical clarity of someone who has been thinking about this moment for a very long time. She tells John that the die is cast. She tells him that she and the children are safe, for now. She tells him that the countryside is in a state of alarm, and that men are moving through the roads toward the fighting. And then she tells him something that distills, in a single sentence, everything essential about who she is. She tells him that she is afraid, and that she is going to continue regardless. John has been selected to attend the Second Continental Congress, which convenes in Philadelphia in May of 1775. He goes. The gap between them widens, not merely in miles but in the scale of what each of them is now managing. He is in Philadelphia helping to organize a continental army, debating the terms of a possible reconciliation with Britain, navigating the competing ambitions and philosophies of 50-odd delegates from 13 colonies with radically different characters and interests. She is in Braintree, 2 miles from the fighting, with 4 children, a farm, and a community in which the ordinary structures of life are beginning to come apart under the pressure of war. She manages. This word manage does not quite capture it. To manage suggests a kind of minimal sufficiency, keeping things from falling apart, maintaining the status quo. What Abigail does is something larger. She maintains the household not as it was but as it needs to be, adapting continuously to conditions that change week by week. When supply shortages hit Massachusetts in the summer of 1775, she finds ways to stretch what she has and source what she cannot grow. When the farm requires decisions about planting and harvest that she has never made before, she makes them with the confidence of someone who has done her research and is prepared to be wrong and correct course. When the children need guidance and education in their father's absence, she provides it, teaching them herself, monitoring their reading, making certain that John Quincy in particular is receiving the kind of intellectual formation that will serve him in whatever world emerges from the current chaos. She writes to John constantly during these months, sometimes daily, though the letters do not always travel promptly or safely. The postal system in a colony at war is not reliable, and Abigail is acutely aware that her letters may be read by people other than their intended recipient. She is careful, but she is not so careful as to blunt her meaning. She has too much to say for excessive caution. She writes about the practical realities of wartime Massachusetts, the rising prices, the scarcity of goods, the difficulty of finding reliable workers when so many men have gone to fight. She writes about the mood of the community, the particular mix of patriotic fervor and quiet dread that characterizes a place close enough to the fighting to understand that it is not a distant abstraction. She writes about the children, about their health and their progress and their questions, because children ask questions even in wartime, perhaps especially in wartime, and Nabby and John Quincy and Charles and Thomas are watching the world crack open around them and need someone to explain to them what they are seeing. She writes, too, about her own emotional life, with a candor that never becomes self-indulgence. She misses John. She says so plainly, without decoration, in the way that people who are genuinely in love and genuinely honest describe genuine loneliness. She misses the conversation, the argument, the particular quality of being known by the person who knows you best. She misses the comfort of a partner in decision-making, the ability to consult rather than simply to decide alone and hope. She does not ask him to come home. She never asks him to come home, never once puts the weight of her loneliness on his shoulders in a way that might compromise his ability to do the work that she believes, with equal conviction to his own, must be done. But she tells him the truth of what his absence costs, because she has never been willing to pretend with him, not from the very beginning, and she is not going to start now. He writes back with equal honesty. His letters to Abigail during this period are among the most revealing he ever writes, more candid, more emotionally transparent, more willing to express doubt and exhaustion and longing than anything he produces for public consumption. He relies on her judgment in ways that he would not publicly admit, asking her what she thinks of various congressional proposals, sharing his frustrations with colleagues, describing the difficulties of building consensus among men who agree on the goal but violently disagree on nearly everything else. He treats her in the private world of their correspondence as the intellectual equal she has always been, and the advice she gives him, specific, practical, unvarnished, is the advice of someone who has thought carefully about the problems he is wrestling with and arrived at positions she can defend. This is what makes their partnership genuinely extraordinary, and what separates it from the merely admirable marriages of other great men and capable women. He is not simply keeping her informed. He is consulting her. Not always, not on everything, and not in a way that he would be comfortable describing to his congressional colleagues. But the consultation is real, and its influence on his thinking is real, and there are moments in the correspondence of 1775 when it is clear that Abigail Adams is doing more than managing a farm in Braintree. She is participating, at a remove of several hundred miles, in the deliberations of the Second Continental Congress. The summer of 1775 brings the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is fought close enough to Braintree that Abigail can hear the cannon from the top of Penn's Hill, near the house. She takes John Quincy, he is 7 years old, and they climb the hill together and watch the smoke rise over Charlestown where the battle is taking place. She will describe this scene in a letter to John with an exactness that leaves nothing to imagination. The smoke, the sound, the child beside her watching with wide grave eyes, and herself, standing on a hill in Massachusetts with the whole uncertain future spread out before her. It is one of the iconic images of her life, and she creates it herself, in real time as it is happening, because she is always writing, always translating experience into language, always insisting that what she sees and feels and understands be put on record somewhere. She loses a dear friend that day. Joseph Warren, one of the most admired patriots in Massachusetts, dies at Bunker Hill. Abigail writes about his death to John with a grief that is personal and a sorrow that is larger than personal, the grief of someone watching the cost of this revolution accumulate name by name, life by life, into a ledger that must be carried by everyone who believes the cause is worth it. She believes it is worth it. She does not pretend the cost is not real. The winter of 1775 into 1776 is the hardest yet. The siege of Boston continues, the city sealed and suffering under British occupation, while the colonial forces dig in on the surrounding heights. Braintree is not in the city, but it is close, and the war's presence is felt in everything. In the scarcity of goods, in the movement of troops through the countryside, in the anxiety that has settled into daily life like a cold that will not quite resolve. Dysentery moves through the community with terrible efficiency, and Abigail's household is not spared. She tends the sick children, manages the farm through an especially difficult winter, and continues to write letters that seem, given everything she is managing, almost miraculous in their sustained intelligence and feeling. She writes to John in March of 1776 about the evacuation of Boston, General Washington's brilliant strategic move to fortify Dorchester Heights, which forces the British to abandon the city rather than face bombardment from above. This is a moment of genuine triumph, and Abigail receives it as such, but she receives it also as someone who knows that a battle won is not a war won, and that the larger question, the question of what the colonies are actually fighting for, what kind of nation they intend to build if they succeed in building one at all, remains urgently and dangerously unresolved. And it is in this spirit that she writes, in March of 1776, the letter that will follow her name through history. She is writing to John, who is in Philadelphia, where the Congress is moving with increasing momentum toward the most radical possible outcome: independence, full and formal, from Great Britain. She is thinking about what independence means. She is thinking about the new code of laws that an independent nation will require. And she writes to him, with the directness that has always characterized her at her most serious, that she hopes he will remember the ladies. The passage is worth sitting with, not as a slogan but as an argument. She tells him that in the new code of laws, she hopes he will remember the ladies and be more generous to them than his ancestors were. She warns him with a dry wit that does not entirely conceal the seriousness beneath it, that all men would be tyrants if they could, and that if women are not represented in the laws that govern them, they will foment a rebellion of their own. She is half joking. She is entirely serious. John writes back with the affectionate condescension of a man who has not quite heard what his wife has said. He teases her. He says that the Congress has troubles enough without adding the ladies to the list. He is charmed by her audacity and unmoved by her argument, at least not moved enough to act on it, and he says so with the easy confidence of a man who does not yet understand that he has just been handed one of the more significant moral challenges of his career and has chosen to decline it. Abigail is not surprised. She is disappointed, but she is not surprised. She has understood for a long time that even the most intelligent and well-intentioned men of her age have a capacity for selective vision that is truly remarkable, that they can argue for liberty with magnificent passion while declining to examine the liberties of the women standing beside them. She does not give up. She does not revise her position. She continues to hold it in subsequent letters, with the patience of someone who understands that some arguments take longer than others to travel the distance between being stated and being heard. The spring of 1776 moves toward its conclusion with a gathering sense of inevitability. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January, has done something extraordinary to the public conversation, taken the argument for independence out of the drawing rooms and Congress halls and into the language of ordinary people, given the cause a moral urgency and a rhetorical force that makes the previous discussion seem almost timid by comparison. Abigail reads it. She tells John it is excellent. She means it. She also means something she does not quite say, which is that she wishes someone would write with equal urgency and equal force about the liberty of women, about the particular condition of human beings who are asked to sacrifice as much as anyone for a revolution that does not include them in its formal promises. She's running a farm. She is raising 4 children. She is managing a community's worth of wartime logistics and anxieties. She is corresponding with one of the most important men in the most important political body in the Western Hemisphere, and her correspondence is shaping his thinking in ways neither of them will ever fully document. She is doing all of this without legal standing, without property rights, without a vote or a voice in any formal assembly. She does it anyway. Not because she has accepted the terms. Not because she has decided that her exclusion is just or reasonable or anything other than what it is, an injustice plainly stated and clearly seen. She does it because the alternative, which is to withdraw from a cause she believes in because that cause has not yet extended its logic all the way to her, is not something she is capable of. She is too invested in the outcome. She cares too much about what happens. She is, in the deepest sense, a patriot, not a patriot of easy sentiment or inherited loyalty, but a patriot of conviction, of reason, of the belief that human beings can build something better than what they have inherited, if they are willing to think clearly and act courageously and keep their promises to one another. She keeps her promises. She has always kept her promises. She runs the farm, raises the children, writes the letters, holds the household together through 2 years of absence and anxiety and wartime scarcity and the constant grinding weight of managing alone. She does it without glory, without formal recognition, without anyone except John Adams and a handful of close friends fully understanding the scale of what she is doing. And she writes it all down. Every decision, every difficulty, every moment of fear and sorrow and dry, defiant humor. She writes it down because she is Abigail Adams, and Abigail Adams does not let things pass unrecorded. She knows, with the instinct of someone who has always understood that her voice matters even when the world disagrees, that these letters are not merely private correspondence. They are testimony. They are evidence. They are the record of a woman who was present at the founding of a nation, and who intends, by the quality and persistence of her attention, to make certain that her presence is not forgotten. She is 31 years old. The revolution is coming to its crisis. And in the farmhouse in Braintree, with the candle burning and the children asleep and the letters spread across the table, Abigail Adams is already writing the history that will outlast everything. Chapter 4, The Call for Rights, 1776 to 1778. There are moments in history that arrive disguised as ordinary ones. They come not with fanfare or formal announcement, but in the middle of everything else. In the middle of a war, in the middle of a marriage, in the middle of a Tuesday in March when the candle needs replacing, and the children need feeding, and the letters have piled up on the table, and the world outside the window is cold and uncertain and full of danger. The moment arrives wrapped in the ordinary, and it is only later, sometimes much later, that anyone understands what it was. The 31st of March, 1776, is such a moment. Abigail Adams is at her desk in the farmhouse in Braintree. The siege of Boston has just concluded. General Washington's forces have taken Dorchester Heights, and the British have evacuated the city. A strategic victory that has sent a current of cautious relief through Massachusetts without quite dissolving the deeper anxiety that has settled into the bones of the colony over the past year. The war is not won. It has barely begun in the larger sense, and everyone who is paying attention, which Abigail invariably is, understands that the battles ahead will be harder and costlier than anything yet seen. John is in Philadelphia. He has been in Philadelphia, with brief interruptions, for the better part of 2 years, and the Congress he is attending is moving week by week and month by month toward a decision that would have seemed almost unthinkable a decade ago and now seems almost inevitable. Independence. The full, formal, irreversible severance of the American colonies from Great Britain. The men in Philadelphia are debating not merely a political question, but an act of creation, the founding of something new in the world, a nation built not on the accident of dynastic inheritance, but on the deliberate articulation of principles, on the argument that certain truths about human beings and their rights are self-evident, and that government derives its just authority from the consent of the governed. Abigail has been following these debates with the attention she brings to everything, reading the newspapers, discussing the arguments in her letters, forming views that are careful and specific and deeply felt. She believes in independence. She has believed in it for some time, longer perhaps than John has been willing to publicly commit, and she finds in the accelerating momentum of early 1776 not simply excitement but a particular kind of urgency, the urgency of someone who understands that moments of genuine political creation are rare, that the window in which a new order can be shaped is brief, and that what is decided in Philadelphia in these months will determine the character of American life for generations. She picks up her pen on the 31st of March, and she begins to write about the new code of laws. The letter she writes to John on that day is not a formal document. It is not a petition or a manifesto or a carefully structured argument designed for public circulation. It is a letter between a husband and wife, written in the intimate, half-playful, wholly serious register that characterizes their correspondence at its most characteristic. She begins by acknowledging that she is about to say something that he may not immediately appreciate. There is a trace of humor in how she sets this up. She is not unaware that she is about to do something slightly audacious, and she does not pretend otherwise. Then she says it. She writes that she desires he would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than his ancestors. She tells him not to put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. She reminds him that all men would be tyrants if they could, and that in this she does not think the character of men particularly distinguished from any other. She warns him with the dry precision that is one of her great literary gifts, that if particular care and attention are not paid to the ladies, they are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold themselves bound by any laws in which they have no voice or representation. She is invoking the very language of the revolution she is helping to sustain. Voice. Representation. The illegitimacy of laws made without the consent of those governed by them. These are not incidental word choices. She is applying with full deliberateness the philosophical framework that her husband and his colleagues are using to justify their separation from Britain, and she is applying it to a situation that is, in her own household and in every household in the colonies, at least as unjust as anything the Crown has imposed. She is pointing out with a clarity that is almost ruthless that the principles being articulated in Philadelphia do not yet reach her, that the liberty being declared does not yet include her, that the revolution, for all its magnificent language, is arguing for the rights of men and meaning quite literally men. She knows this will not be immediately persuasive. She is not naive about the limits of what a letter can accomplish, even a letter to one of the most influential men in the Continental Congress. She is not expecting John to walk into the chamber the following morning and propose an amendment to whatever declaration is being drafted on behalf of the ladies of Massachusetts. She is doing something both more modest and more consequential than that. She is putting the argument on record. She is making certain that it is said clearly and without apology, in a place where it cannot be ignored even if it can for now be declined. John's response arrives in early April, and it is, by the standards of their marriage, a disappointment. He is charmed by her letter, he says so, and the charm is genuine. He teases her about the sauciness of her argument. He suggests that the Congress has rather more pressing matters on its agenda than the political rights of women. He writes with the fond, slightly patronizing warmth of a man who loves his wife's mind and has not quite understood what she has said. He tells her that her letter has made him laugh. He does not engage with the argument. He deflects. This is not the response of a cruel man or an indifferent one. It is the response of an intelligent man who has not yet done the work of applying his own principles consistently, which is a very different thing and in some ways a more frustrating one. Cruelty can be opposed. Indifference can be addressed. But the benevolent failure to extend one's stated principles to their logical conclusions, the warm, affectionate, fundamentally unchanged unwillingness to see what is right in front of one, this is harder to address because it wraps itself in the language of affection and makes the person raising the objection feel ungrateful for doing so. Abigail is not ungrateful. She is also not finished. She writes again a few weeks later to her friend Mercy Otis Warren, one of the most important women in her circle, a playwright and political writer of considerable ability, one of the very few women of her era who is doing in public something like what Abigail is doing in private. She tells Mercy about the exchange with John, about the request and the deflection, and she is wry about it because she is almost always wry about the things that hurt her most. But she is also clear that she has not revised her position. That what she asked for was reasonable. That what she received in response was not. She does not dramatize this. She states it. And then she continues. This is the pattern of Abigail Adams's advocacy, not a single great confrontation, but a sustained, unrelenting pressure maintained across years and decades, never abandoned and never fully rewarded in her lifetime, but never withdrawn. She will return to the question of women's rights and women's education and women's legal standing again and again throughout her correspondence, always with the same combination of precision and feeling, always with the same refusal to treat the injustice as anything other than what it is, always with the same dry recognition that the men best positioned to address it are on the whole choosing not to. But the spring of 1776 contains other arguments as well, and Abigail is conducting them simultaneously with the same inexhaustible engagement. Because the question of who is included in the Revolution's promises is not, for her, only a question about women. It is also, with increasing urgency, a question about enslaved people. Abigail Adams has grown up in a society in which slavery exists, though Massachusetts is not the Deep South, and the institution is not as visibly brutal in her daily environment as it is further down the eastern seaboard. But she has thought about it. She has thought about it with the rigorous consistency of someone who takes principles seriously enough to follow them wherever they lead. And the principle of liberty, followed consistently, leads somewhere very clear. If the argument against British tyranny rests on the claim that no human being should be subject to authority exercised without their consent, and this is precisely what the argument rests on, then the same logic applies without exception or qualification to enslaved people. The inconsistency is not subtle. It is glaring. And Abigail has been aware of it for years. She writes about it to John in the context of the debates over independence, and her position is not hedged or complicated by the political calculations that lead many of her contemporaries to look away. She finds the institution morally indefensible. She says so. She cannot understand how men who are arguing with such passion for their own liberty can fail to see the contradiction in denying that same liberty to human beings who are living within sight of them. She uses the word inconsistency, which in Abigail's vocabulary is one of the more damning terms available, because consistency, the willingness to apply one's principles without convenient exception, is for her among the highest moral virtues. John does not disagree with her on this, not in private. He finds slavery abhorrent. He has said so in his diary, in conversations with colleagues, in terms that leave no ambiguity about his personal moral position. But he is also a politician, which means he is acutely aware that the Southern delegates to the Continental Congress will not sign any declaration that directly threatens the institution of slavery, and that a declaration signed by 12 colonies is infinitely less valuable than a declaration not signed at all. He makes the calculation that many men of genuine conscience make in that moment, that independence first, slavery later is the only viable path forward, and that the alternative is to achieve neither. Abigail understands the calculation. She does not entirely accept it. She sees with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who is not in the room where the compromise is being made, that what is being traded away in the name of political necessity is not an abstract principle, but the lived liberty of human beings, that later is a very long time for a person living in bondage, that the postponement of justice is never without cost, and that the nation being born in Philadelphia is embedding in its foundations a contradiction that will not resolve itself quietly or cheaply or soon. She is right about all of this. The Civil War, nearly 90 years away, will prove her right in terms so catastrophic that the word vindication hardly seems adequate. But in 1776, she can only see as far as her own arguments carry her, and her arguments carry her to the same place they always do, the insistence that principles must be applied consistently, that the logic of liberty does not come with exceptions, and that a nation founded on stated ideals has an obligation, not merely a rhetorical one, to live up to them. She is also, during this period, thinking with increasing intensity about education. This is not a new preoccupation. Education has been at the center of Abigail's understanding of herself and her world since she first discovered what a book could do for a mind that was ready for it. But the Revolution gives the question a new urgency, because the Republic being created in Philadelphia will require, as many of its founders understand, an educated citizenry. Without education, democracy is merely the illusion of self-governance, the form without the substance, the vote without the capacity to cast it meaningfully. Abigail agrees with this completely. And she extends the argument one critical step further than most of her male contemporaries are willing to go. She argues that the education of women is not merely a nice addition to the project of Republican self-improvement. It is foundational. It is, in fact, the prerequisite for everything else. Because women raise the children. Because the first education any citizen receives is the education given by a mother, in the home, in the years before schoolrooms and tutors and formal curricula become relevant. If women are not educated, if they remain as they largely are, confined to the domestic arts, and denied access to history, philosophy, science, and political thought, then the children they raise will be educated inadequately, regardless of what happens subsequently in any schoolroom. She articulates this argument to John, to Mercy Warren, to her sister Mary, and to the various correspondents with whom she maintains the wide, active intellectual life that her situation does not prevent and her character will not permit her to abandon. She argues for girls' schools with the same conviction she brings to everything. She argues for curricula that take the female mind seriously, that treat women as capable of reason and analysis, and the kind of abstract thought that has historically been reserved for their male counterparts. She argues, in essence, for the education she herself received by accident, through illness and a father's library, and for the principle that accident should not be the mechanism by which any mind is given or denied access to its full potential. She makes these arguments while managing everything else. This is the essential fact of Abigail Adams's intellectual life during these years. It is conducted in parallel with, not in replacement of, the enormous practical demands of her daily existence. She is not a woman of leisure, writing pamphlets from a comfortable study. She is a woman running a farm and raising 4 children, and managing a household through wartime scarcity, who also happens to be conducting, simultaneously, one of the more sustained and serious intellectual engagements with the political questions of her age that any American of her generation is conducting, of either sex in any setting. The year 1776 reaches its great climax in July, when the Declaration of Independence is adopted by the Continental Congress. Abigail does not receive the news immediately. The postal system is still unreliable, the distance from Philadelphia to Braintree is still considerable, and the news travels in layers, the first reports arriving incomplete and the full text following more slowly. But when it arrives, she receives it with a feeling that she describes to John as something between exhilaration and solemnity. She believes in what has been declared. She believes in the principles set out in Jefferson's language, the self-evident truths, the unalienable rights, the government deriving just powers from the consent of the governed. She believes in all of it. She also notices, and she cannot not notice, what is missing. The Declaration speaks of all men being created equal. She has written to John about this. She knows what was considered and what was not considered in the drafting of those words. She knows that the ladies were not remembered, not formally, not in the document that will define the Republic's foundational commitments. She knows that the enslaved men and women, whose labor is building the wealth of the Southern colonies, are not included in the liberty being declared. She knows that the universalism of the language and the particularity of its application are in profound and painful tension. She celebrates anyway, because the Declaration, for all its incompleteness, is something. It is a foundation. It is a set of commitments that, once made in public and inscribed in the founding documents of a nation, cannot be entirely retracted, commitments that will be returned to, argued over, extended and revised and fought over for centuries, by people who take the stated principles seriously enough to demand that they be honored. Abigail Adams is one of those people. She intends to keep returning. She intends to keep arguing. The Declaration does not include her, but it also does not say that the list is closed. And she is, above all, a person who understands that the work of liberty is long. John is home briefly in the late summer of 1776, and the reunion, as always after a long separation, is warm and slightly formal. 2 people who know each other intimately and are also, after months apart, slightly unfamiliar with the physical reality of each other, the sound of a voice in a room rather than on a page. They talk for hours. She shows him the farm, which she has kept better than he expected, and which she takes a quiet, legitimate pride in having maintained. He tells her about Philadelphia, about the debates, about the personalities of the men he has been working alongside. They argue comfortably about everything. He leaves again. He always leaves again in these years. The Congress needs him. The country, which is now officially a country, needs him. And Abigail, who has made her peace with this arrangement without entirely accepting its injustice, manages. She always manages. The years 1777 and 1778 bring new crises layered on the ongoing ones. The war moves south and the military situation is grave. British forces take Philadelphia in September of 1777, forcing the Congress to relocate, and the winter at Valley Forge nearly destroys the Continental Army. Abigail follows these developments from Braintree with the tight attention of someone who understands that the outcome is not guaranteed, that the revolution she has committed herself to could fail, and that failure would carry consequences that extend far beyond political disappointment. She manages another miscarriage during this period, a loss she records with the restraint that characterizes her writing about personal grief, which is to say, briefly and without self-pity, in a way that acknowledges the sorrow without permitting it to become the subject. She is not a woman who makes her suffering central, not because she does not feel it, but because she has determined, consciously or not, that she will not be defined by what has been taken from her. She will be defined by what she makes of what remains. She educates the children. She manages the farm through another hard winter. She writes the letters that sustain her marriage and inform her husband's thinking and record, with an accuracy and an intimacy that no other source quite matches, the texture of life in revolutionary Massachusetts. She argues in those letters for the rights of women and the rights of the enslaved, for the education of girls, and the consistent application of the principles being inscribed in the founding documents of the new nation. Nobody in any official capacity is listening. The Congress does not pass legislation on behalf of the ladies. The contradictions of the founding documents remain contradictions, enormous and unresolved, and destined to become the central crisis of the century to come. The education of women does not immediately improve. The things Abigail is arguing for are, in the short term, argued for without result. But the argument is made. And it is made with such clarity, such consistency, such evident intelligence and moral seriousness, that it cannot be simply dismissed or forgotten. It exists in the letters which are preserved, which will be read, which will eventually be recognized, as some of the most remarkable documents produced by anyone in proximity to the American founding. Abigail Adams is not naive enough to believe that saying a thing and having it heard are the same. She knows they are not. She has ample evidence that they are not. But she also knows, with the conviction of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding the relationship between language and power, that unsaid things have no chance at all. Said things clearly, honestly, with precision and feeling, and the refusal to pretend that injustice is acceptable, said things persist. They travel. They arrive, sometimes very late, but they arrive. She keeps saying them. The candle burns. The letters pile up. Outside the window, the revolution continues its uncertain, costly, magnificent progress toward an outcome no one can yet see clearly. And inside, at her desk, Abigail Adams does what she has always done. She thinks. She writes. She refuses to be silent. She is 33 years old. She is already, though no one has yet found the right words for it, one of the most important voices of her age. And the story is not close to finished. Chapter 5, An Atlantic Divide, 1778 to 1784. There is a particular kind of absence that is different from all others. Not the absence of death, which is total and permanent and carries with it, eventually, the terrible mercy of finality. Not the absence of estrangement, which is chosen and carries its own particular grief. This is the absence of necessity, the absence of a person who is alive and well and simply elsewhere, on the other side of an ocean, doing important work that both parties believe in, and that neither party would undo if given the choice. It is the hardest kind of absence to grieve cleanly, because it comes wrapped in pride and purpose, and because to mourn it too openly is to seem ungrateful for the very things that make it necessary. Abigail Adams will live inside this absence for 6 years. The sequence of events that creates the Atlantic Divide begins in 1778, when John Adams is appointed by the Continental Congress to serve as one of the American commissioners to France. The appointment is an honor, a recognition of his standing and his abilities, and it is also, from the perspective of the farmhouse in Braintree, a sentence. France is not Philadelphia. France is not a hard ride down a series of known roads, a destination reachable in days, and connected by a postal system that is unreliable but not impossible. France is an ocean away, in a time when the ocean crossing takes weeks under the best conditions and rather longer under the worst, when ships are lost to storms and to British naval vessels alike, and when a letter sent in January might arrive in April or might not arrive at all. John goes in February of 1778, taking 12-year-old John Quincy with him. A decision made in the belief that the experience will be formative for the boy, which it is, though Abigail feels the loss of both of them simultaneously, with a sharpness she does not fully express in the letter she writes in the weeks after their departure. She writes to John with her usual composure, her usual intelligence, her usual refusal to let emotion overwhelm the practical business of the correspondence. But there is something in the letters of this period that is different from what came before: a thinness in certain places, a space where something has been carefully omitted, that suggests she is managing herself as much as she is managing the household. The household she manages is now more complex than ever. The farm must continue. The finances must be handled. 3 children remain with her: Nabby, now 13, and Charles and Thomas, younger still, and their education, their health, their daily lives require the same attention they have always required, without the resource of a partner to consult, or a father to provide authority, or simply the comfort of another adult presence in the house when the day has been difficult. She is, in the precise and practical sense, a single parent. She does not use this language, the concept does not quite exist in her time, but she lives it with the thoroughness of someone who has no choice, and the competence of someone who has been preparing for exactly this without knowing it for years. The financial situation is serious. John's salary as a diplomat is neither generous nor reliable, and the farm in Braintree does not produce sufficient income to support a household of the size and complexity that the Adams family now represents. Abigail must manage money with an exactness that borders on the mathematical, tracking expenditures and income with the rigor of a bookkeeper, making decisions about what can and cannot be afforded with a precision that leaves very little margin for error. She is good at this, better perhaps than she expected to be, and she discovers in the management of household finances a capacity for economic analysis that will, over the coming years, expand into something considerably more sophisticated. She begins to invest. This is not the word she uses, and it is not in the formal sense what she would have called it. But the activity she engages in during these years, purchasing goods that are scarce and therefore valuable, trading in goods whose value she has assessed accurately, making calculated decisions about land and property, and the movement of goods in a wartime economy, is investment, conducted with an intelligence and a nerve that most of her contemporaries would not have credited to a woman managing a farm in Braintree. She corresponds with merchants in Boston. She arranges for goods to be shipped from Europe, items that are difficult to obtain in Massachusetts, and that command a premium when they can be found. She asks John in her letters to send specific goods from France: fabrics, ribbons, handkerchiefs, small luxury items that can be sold in the Boston market at a profit that will help to sustain the family finances during his absence. She is not embarrassed by this. She is practical. She has a family to support, and a husband on the other side of an ocean, and an economy distorted by years of war, and she will use every tool available to her to keep the household solvent. John complies, though not always with the specificity she requests, and not always with the understanding that what she is doing is serious economic management rather than shopping by proxy. He sends things. He also sends advice that is occasionally less useful than the goods. Advice about economy and caution from a man who is living in Paris and experiencing its considerable pleasures. Advice that Abigail receives with the particular patience of someone who knows that the person offering the advice is not in a position to fully understand the situation it is meant to address. She does not say this. She thanks him for the goods. She continues to manage. The letters during this first French period are different in tone from those that preceded them. The distance is greater, the postal delays longer, and there is a new quality in Abigail's writing, a more careful, more deliberate quality, as if she is aware that each letter must do more work than usual because the next one may not arrive for months. She chooses what to say with greater intentionality. She is less likely to dash off an observation or a feeling in the moment, and more likely to compose, to think about what she wants John to know and understand, and to construct the letter around those things. The correspondence remains extraordinary, but it has acquired the particular weight of words that must travel very far. She also writes, during these years, to an expanding circle of correspondents who will become increasingly important to her intellectual and emotional life. Mercy Otis Warren remains a central figure. The two women correspond with a freedom and a candor that the more guarded context of the Adams marriage does not always permit, writing to each other about politics and literature and the situation of women with the relief of people who do not need to be careful. Abigail also corresponds with her sister Mary, with various friends in Massachusetts, and with a growing number of the political figures who move through her husband's orbit and who have learned, sometimes to their initial surprise, that corresponding with Abigail Adams is not a courtesy but an engagement, that she reads everything, thinks about everything, and responds with a precision and a force that demands to be taken seriously. John returns from France in 1779, having accomplished rather less than he hoped. The diplomatic situation in Paris is complicated by the presence of Benjamin Franklin, whose easy social brilliance is more suited to the French court than John's blunt, argumentative New England style, and whose seniority in the diplomatic hierarchy makes John's position perpetually subordinate and perpetually frustrating. He comes home thinner and more irascible than he left, full of opinions about French politics and the state of the American diplomatic mission and the various ways in which he has been undervalued and overlooked. And Abigail receives him with the warmth and the clear eyes of someone who has been managing alone for 18 months and who loves him completely and sees him without illusion. The reunion is brief. It is always brief in these years. The Congress has decided before John has fully recovered from the Atlantic crossing that he is needed abroad again, this time as the minister plenipotentiary to negotiate peace with Britain whenever Britain is ready to negotiate, which may be some time. He is also assigned responsibility for negotiating a commercial treaty. The appointments are significant. They are also a return ticket to an ocean away. He goes in November of 1779, taking John Quincy again, and this time also taking Charles, the middle son, who is 9 years old and whose temperament, more sensitive, more volatile than his older brother, makes the decision retrospectively troubling, though no one knows this yet. Abigail is left again in Braintree with Nabby and Thomas. The Atlantic Divide resumes. It will not close for nearly 5 years. This is the period that Abigail will later describe, with characteristic understatement, as her widowhood. The word is chosen carefully, because she is not a widow. John is alive, he writes, he is engaged in important work on behalf of a country she loves. But the practical experience of her life during these years, the sole management of household and finances and children, the absence of a partner, the loneliness that is constant, and that she manages with the same methodical discipline she applies to everything, is as close to widowhood as marriage can come without crossing the line. She is extraordinary during this period. The word is not an exaggeration. What Abigail Adams accomplishes between 1779 and 1784, in circumstances that would have defeated many people of either sex, is genuinely remarkable. And the record she leaves of it, in the letters that continue across the Atlantic with stubborn, devoted regularity, is one of the great documents of American life in the founding era. She manages the farm through years that include difficult harvests and persistent labor shortages, and the slow, grinding disruption of a wartime economy that is beginning as the fighting winds down, to transition into the even more uncertain economy of a new nation finding its financial footing. She manages the family's money with increasing sophistication, moving beyond the basic trading activities of the first absence into more deliberate investment in land and property. She identifies parcels of land in Massachusetts that she believes will increase in value as the post-war economy stabilizes, and she pursues these investments with a boldness that surprises John when she reports them to him, and that she defends in her letters with economic arguments that are clear and specific and almost always correct. He is not always immediately supportive. John Adams has, in addition to his many admirable qualities, a deep streak of conventional thinking about the proper roles of men and women, and a woman making independent investment decisions falls, in his mental geography, slightly outside the proper bounds of domestic management. He expresses this with varying degrees of directness in his letters. Abigail receives his reservations, considers them, and does what she thinks is right. She is not insubordinate about it. She is not the kind of person who relishes conflict for its own sake, and she genuinely respects John's intelligence and his judgment in most areas. But she is also, by this point in her life, a woman of 50 who has been running this household alone for years and who has earned, through sheer demonstrated competence, the right to trust her own assessment. The letters she writes during the early 1780s have a quality that is different from anything that preceded them, a fullness and authority, the writing of someone who has fully inhabited her own capabilities and who is no longer, even in the private space of correspondence with her husband, performing any kind of modesty she does not feel. She writes about politics with the directness of a peer, analyzing the conduct of the war and the negotiations for peace with the same penetrating attention she has always brought to these questions, but with less of the careful qualification that marked her earlier letters, less of the implicit apology for having views at all. She has been following the peace negotiations with intense interest. The Treaty of Paris, which is finalized in September of 1783 and formally ends the Revolutionary War, is the culmination of years of diplomatic work in which John has been centrally involved, first in the difficult multi-party negotiations with France and Britain and the Netherlands, and then in the final push toward a peace that secures American independence and establishes the new nation's territorial claims. Abigail follows these negotiations through John's letters, through the newspapers, through the letters of other correspondents who are connected to the diplomatic world, and she has opinions about all of it that she shares with John in terms that are specific and sometimes pointed. She is concerned, during this period, about the financial settlement, about whether the treaty adequately protects American commercial interests, about the terms under which trade with Britain will be conducted, about the question of debts and loyalists, and the various practical complications that attend the formal end of a war. Her concerns are not abstract. She is living inside the wartime economy, managing finances in an environment shaped by the conflict. And the question of what peace will mean for ordinary economic life in Massachusetts is not theoretical for her. She writes about it from that position of lived knowledge, and her analysis is often sharper than what John is receiving from colleagues who are thinking about it from a greater remove. John Quincy returns from Europe in 1781. Having spent 3 years in diplomatic circles and educational institutions on the continent that have given him, at 14, an intellectual formation of extraordinary breadth. He arrives back in Massachusetts speaking French and Dutch, having traveled across Europe, having observed some of the most sophisticated political and diplomatic environments in the world. Abigail receives him with the complex mixture of pride and slightly aching recognition that mothers feel when they understand that a child has grown into something during an absence that they did not witness. He is not the boy who left. He is becoming the man who will eventually be president, though no one knows this yet. And the formation has happened largely without her, across an ocean under the supervision of a father who has also, in his way, been largely without her. Charles comes home in 1781 as well, under circumstances that are less triumphant. He has been unhappy in Europe, homesick and unsettled, his more sensitive temperament poorly suited to the rootless diplomatic life. He arrives back in Massachusetts changed in ways that worry Abigail, though she cannot yet name precisely what worries her. She watches him with the careful attention of a mother who knows one of her children needs something, and is not yet certain what it is. She will watch him with increasing concern for years. The story of Charles Adams is one of the more painful stories embedded in the larger story of this family, and its roots can be traced, at least in part, to these years of displacement and uncertainty, and the particular damage that prolonged parental absence can inflict on a child who is not built for it. Nabby, meanwhile, has grown into a young woman of 19, capable and composed, with her mother's steady temperament and something of her father's stubbornness. She is her mother's primary companion during the long years of John's absence, and the closeness between them during this period is the closeness of two people who have been through something difficult together and have learned in the process to rely on each other in ways that go beyond the ordinary bonds of mother and daughter. Abigail is not blind to the ways in which Nabby has been required to grow up quickly, has been asked to be more adult than her years strictly require, has had the ordinary freedoms of a young woman somewhat curtailed by the demands of a household that needed her. She is grateful, and she is also, in the private record of her letters, quietly regretful about what has been asked. Thomas, the youngest, is still a child through most of this period, 8 years old when John leaves in 1779, not quite 14 when John finally returns. He grows up in a household run by women, in a community shaped by war, with a father who exists primarily as a voice on paper and a periodic visitor. He is, by temperament, the least complicated of the Adams children. Steady, good-natured, uncomplicated in a family of complicated people, and Abigail manages his childhood with the competence she brings to everything, though it is worth noting in the quiet arithmetic of these years that Thomas Adams grows up knowing his mother far better than he knows his father, and that this too is a consequence that has not been fully counted in the ledger of what the revolution cost. The winter of 1783 into 1784 is a winter of decision. The war is over. The treaty is signed. The new nation is, in the formal sense, established. John's diplomatic work continues. There are commercial treaties to negotiate, relationships with European powers to cultivate, the endless complex work of building a nation's foreign policy from nothing. But the immediate emergency is past, and the question of why the Adams family remains divided by an ocean is harder to answer than it was when the answer was simply, because there is a war. Abigail has been waiting for this question to resolve itself into an answer she can act on. She has been waiting, with increasing impatience and decreasing willingness to continue waiting, for permission to cross the ocean. Not John's permission exactly, though she would not phrase it in precisely those terms, but the convergence of circumstances that would make the crossing possible. John has suggested more than once that she should come to Europe. She has demurred, citing the children, the farm, the finances, the difficulty of the crossing, the uncertainty of the diplomatic situation. Some of these reasons are real. Some of them are the reasons she tells herself. The real reason, the reason she circles in her letters without quite landing on it, is that crossing the Atlantic Ocean in 1784 is genuinely terrifying. Not in a vague, theoretical sense, but in the specific, practical sense of a woman who knows that ships go down, that the crossing can take 2 months, that she will be seasick and frightened and far from everything she has ever known. She is not a woman given to admitting fear, and she does not fully admit this one. But it is there, visible between the lines of her letters in the winter of 1784, in the way she keeps raising objections and then addressing them herself, as if she is conducting an internal argument that the letters have accidentally made audible. She makes the decision in the spring of 1784. She will go. She will take Nabby, 18-year-old Nabby, who has never been anywhere beyond Massachusetts, and who approaches the prospect of Europe with a combination of excitement and the careful, controlled expectation that is her mother's most clearly inherited trait. She will arrange the farm and the finances and the children who are not coming. John Quincy is at Harvard, Charles and Thomas are settled in arrangements that can be sustained in her absence, and she will cross the Atlantic Ocean to join the husband she has not lived with in any sustained way for 6 years. The decision made, she moves with the efficiency that characterizes her approach to every undertaking. She writes letters of arrangement to everyone who needs them. She organizes the farm's management in her absence. She settles the accounts. She makes lists, the precise, comprehensive lists of a woman who does not leave things to chance, who knows from long experience that the things not prepared for are the things that cause difficulty, and who has enough faith in her own foresight to believe that sufficient preparation can address most of what the future might bring. She cannot quite prepare, in the end, for the emotional reality of what she is doing. She is leaving Braintree. She is leaving the house where she has lived her entire married life, where she has raised her children and managed her farm and conducted, from a distance of several thousand miles, one of the great intellectual partnerships of the founding era. She is leaving the known world, the salt air and the church bells and the neighbors and the particular quality of light on a Massachusetts morning, for something entirely unknown. She is 40 years old. She has spent 6 years managing alone, with a competence and a grace that history will struggle to adequately honor. She has run a farm and raised children, and managed investments and conducted political correspondence, and argued for the rights of women and the rights of the enslaved and the necessity of education for girls, all from the plain farmhouse in Braintree that has been, through all of it, the center of her world. The ship is called the Active. It will sail in June of 1784. Abigail Adams will be on it. She stands on the shore of Massachusetts in the early summer and looks at the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, which has separated her from her husband for 6 years and which she is about to cross, seasick and frightened and composed and completely, irreversibly decided. She is going toward John. She is going toward Europe. She is going toward the next chapter of a life that has already exceeded, in its richness and its difficulty, and its extraordinary ordinary demands, anything she could have imagined from the parsonage in Weymouth where it began. She goes. The shore recedes. The Atlantic opens before her, like a question she has decided to answer. She does not look back. Chapter 6, European Courts, 1784 to 1788. Chapter 6, European Courts. 1784 to 1788. The Atlantic Ocean in the summer of 1784 is not a romantic proposition. It is 30 days of close quarters and persistent nausea, and the particular helplessness of a person who has, for the first time in her adult life, surrendered all control over her circumstances to forces, wind, current, the competence of strangers, that no amount of intelligence or preparation can influence. Abigail Adams, who has spent 6 years controlling everything within her reach with extraordinary precision, spends the crossing largely unable to control anything at all. She is seasick. She is frightened. She is, by the account she will later give, more thoroughly miserable than she has been at any point in a life that has not been short on difficulty. She is also watching everything. Because she is Abigail Adams, and Abigail Adams does not stop observing simply because she is uncomfortable. She watches the crew and the other passengers. She notices the quality of the food and the character of the captain, and the way the ocean changes color in different weather. She makes mental notes that will become letters, and letters that will become the record of everything she sees and thinks and feels across the 4 years that Europe will ask of her. The nausea is real. The attention is relentless. Both things are true simultaneously, as they so often are when the subject is Abigail Adams. The Active makes land at Deal on the English coast, in late July of 1784. England, not France. The practical geography of Atlantic crossings in the 18th century means that France will be reached overland, through the English countryside and across the Channel. Abigail steps onto solid ground in England for the first time in her life, and her first response is the response of someone who has been reading about a place for 30 years and is now measuring the reality against the accumulated image. She finds England beautiful and somewhat smaller than she expected, and she finds the English people, at least those she encounters in the first days, agreeable and rather more like New Englanders than she had entirely anticipated. She has a few weeks in London before the journey to France, and she spends them with the systematic thoroughness of a person who understands that she is unlikely to pass this way again and intends to see everything. She visits the shops, which she finds extraordinary in their variety and their quality, and writes to her niece back in Massachusetts with descriptions of the goods available that are almost giddy in their detail, the fabrics, the china, the particular abundance of a city that has not been living through a war. She visits the theater and finds it magnificent, and writes about it with the enthusiasm of someone who has been starved of this particular pleasure for years. She visits the parks and the churches and the houses of people to whom she has been given letters of introduction, and she navigates the social world of London in the summer of 1784 with the careful attention of an anthropologist studying a culture that is both familiar and strange. Nabby is with her through all of this, and the picture of the two of them, mother and daughter, both dark-eyed, both composed, both possessed of the particular Adams quality of watchful intelligence, moving through London society is one of the more appealing images of Abigail's European years. They are close, these two, in the way that people become close who have been through difficulty together. And Nabby's presence is a genuine comfort to Abigail in the first weeks of a disorientation that she manages expertly but feels deeply. The reunion with John, when it comes, is in Paris, and it is, like all their reunions after long separations, warm and slightly awkward and full of the readjustment that attends the joining of two people who have been living separate lives and must now relearn the ordinary rhythms of living one together. He is thinner than she remembers, and older, and more deeply embedded in the French diplomatic world than she had fully understood from his letters. He is also, this is the word she will use privately in her letters home, lonely. The loneliness of a person who has spent 6 years in brilliant company without the company of the person who knows him best. She looks at him and sees all of this. She says some of it. The rest she files away in the part of her that is always observing, always understanding more than she immediately expresses. Paris receives Abigail Adams in the summer of 1784, with all the complexity of a city that is, in nearly every conceivable way, unlike anything she has experienced. She has grown up in a culture of Puritan simplicity, where ornament is suspicious, and extravagance is a moral failing, and the display of wealth is a form of vanity to be resisted. Paris is the capital of extravagance. It is a city of astonishing beauty and staggering inequality, of magnificent architecture and filthy streets, of a court culture so elaborate and so self-referential that it seems, to a woman from Braintree, Massachusetts, to have lost all meaningful connection to the actual lives of actual people. She is dazzled. She would not admit to being dazzled, because being dazzled implies a kind of passive receptivity that is not in her nature, and because the dazzlement is complicated from the beginning by a Puritan conscience that finds the magnificence troubling even as the aesthetic sense responds to it. She writes to her sister Mary about Paris with a mixture of wonder and alarm that is entirely characteristic, the wonder genuine, the alarm equally genuine, and the combination producing letters of unusual texture that capture, more accurately than any purely positive or purely negative account could, the genuine complexity of encountering a civilization that is brilliant and corrupt and beautiful and unjust in proportions she has never previously encountered. She finds the French women fascinating and faintly scandalous. The social freedom of Parisian women of the upper classes, their presence in intellectual and political life, their ease in mixed company, the frank worldliness of their conversation, is both more than Abigail expected and less than she might have hoped for. Because the freedom she observes with her characteristic precision is a particular kind of freedom, the freedom of ornament rather than substance, the freedom to be witty and influential in the drawing room, without any corresponding freedom in law or property or civic life. French women, she notes, are present in ways that American women are not, and they are simultaneously constrained in ways that are different but not necessarily less complete. She is not entirely sure what to make of this. She writes about it carefully, turning it over in several letters, arriving at no simple conclusion because there is no simple conclusion to arrive at. She meets Benjamin Franklin. He is 78 years old, white-haired and magnificent, the most famous American in Europe and possibly the most famous man in the Western world, and he receives Abigail in his house at Passy with the easy practiced charm of someone who has been charming people professionally for 6 decades and has gotten very good at it. She is not uncharmed. She would be superhuman not to be somewhat charmed by Benjamin Franklin. But she is also, characteristically, not only charmed. She sees the charm and she sees what the charm is doing, and she sees the household he keeps, his easy tolerance of his grandson's somewhat dissolute habits, the somewhat irregular domestic arrangements, the general atmosphere of a man who has decided that the ordinary rules do not entirely apply to him, and she finds it, while acknowledging the genius, not entirely admirable. She says so in her letters, with the careful phrasing of someone who knows that Franklin is important to her husband's diplomatic work, and that unqualified criticism would be both unfair and imprudent, but who is also constitutionally incapable of simply not noticing what she has noticed. It is one of the ongoing tensions of Abigail's European years, the gap between what she observes and what it is socially or diplomatically advisable to say openly, managed through the medium of private correspondence, which allows her to be honest without being public. John Quincy is in Europe as well during this period, studying and traveling with a seriousness and a breadth of engagement that simultaneously delights and slightly overwhelms his parents. He is 17, already formed in ways that make him seem older, already possessed of the linguistic facility and the intellectual range that will define his public career. His relationship with his mother during these European years has a quality of mutual recognition, two people who are very similar discovering in proximity both the pleasure of that similarity and its occasional friction. He is in some ways the child she understands best. He is also in some ways the child most capable of causing her a particular kind of exasperation, because the qualities that make him remarkable are also the qualities that make him difficult. The family moves to London in 1785, when John is appointed the first American minister to the court of St. James, the first representative of the new United States to the country from which it has just separated, after a war, after a revolution, after a declaration that the relationship between the two nations is fundamentally and permanently changed. It is, by any measure, one of the more delicate diplomatic positions imaginable, and John walks into it with the combination of conviction and combativeness that characterizes his public style, prepared to insist on American dignity and interest regardless of the social discomfort this creates. Abigail walks into it alongside him, and what is asked of her in London is something for which nothing in Braintree or even Paris has quite prepared her. She must navigate the British court. She must represent the new United States, this young, awkward, financially unstable, diplomatically untested republic, in the most formal and status-conscious social environment in the Western world, a world organized around centuries of hierarchy and precedent and the careful, elaborate management of social rank, a world that looks at the American Republic with a mixture of condescension and wariness and is not in the main inclined to make the experience easy. She prepares for the court presentation with characteristic thoroughness. The rules are elaborate and unforgiving. Specific dress is required, specific behavior at specific moments, the precise management of curtsies and positioning, and the order in which one approaches the royal presence. Abigail, who has spent her life dismissing unnecessary formality as a distraction from more serious matters, submits to the requirements with the pragmatism of someone who understands that this particular formality is not optional, and that the dignity of her country is in some measure expressed through her willingness to perform it correctly. She is presented to King George III and Queen Charlotte at a court drawing room, dressed in the elaborate style required by the occasion, and she navigates the presentation with the composed exterior that she can always summon, regardless of what she is actually feeling. Afterward, she writes about it to her sister Mary with the honesty that is bracing, about the strangeness of curtsying to a king from whom her country has just won its independence, about the elaborate absurdity of the ritual, about the Queen's pleasant if unremarkable demeanor, and about the king, whom she observes with careful attention and finds, this is the word she uses, merely human. George III in person is a man of ordinary dimensions. She has spent enough years thinking about what his government has done to her country that she expected something larger, or perhaps something monstrous. She finds instead a man in a wig, performing a role in a ritual, much as she is performing one herself. The social world of London is in some ways more familiar than Paris, and in other ways more difficult. The language is the same, the culture shares enough with New England to feel recognizable at moments, and the intellectual life of the city, the salons, the scientific societies, the literary circles, is exactly the kind of environment in which Abigail can engage most authentically. She attends concerts and theatrical performances and dinners with people whose names she has known from books and newspapers, and she brings to these encounters the same alert, precise attention she brings to everything, forming views about everyone she meets and recording those views in her letters with a vividness that makes them present still. But London is also the capital of a country that has not entirely forgiven the Revolution or accepted the legitimacy of the republic it produced. And the social atmosphere surrounding the American legation has a quality of barely concealed hostility that makes even ordinary social functions a kind of negotiation. John's diplomatic efforts to establish a commercial treaty with Britain are frustrated at every turn by a British government that sees very little incentive to make things easy for its former colonies. The frustration is professional, but it is also personal, and it infiltrates the household in ways that make the London years, for all their extraordinary experience, not entirely happy ones. Abigail manages the legation household with the same meticulous competence she has always brought to domestic management, but on a scale and with a complexity that exceeds anything Braintree required. The household of an American minister in London must project both dignity and Republican simplicity, a combination that is, in the context of London society, nearly paradoxical, because London's version of dignity involves an expenditure of resources that Republican simplicity explicitly rejects. She manages the tension between these imperatives with skill and with a frugality that is entirely genuine, because the salary allotted to the American minister is genuinely inadequate to the social demands of the position, and the gap must be managed somehow. She writes to John Jay, then serving as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, about the financial inadequacy of the diplomatic allowances with a directness that he probably did not expect, and that makes entirely clear she considers the inadequacy not merely inconvenient, but a failure of the Republic to properly support its own representation abroad. She is right. The allowances are inadequate. Nothing immediately changes, but the letter is written, the argument is made, and she has at least ensured that the failure is documented by someone who understands exactly what it costs. It is during the London years that Nabby marries. The man she chooses, or the man who is chosen, because the distinction is not always entirely clear in the Adams household, is William Stephen Smith, a handsome, personable young colonel who has served on Washington's staff and who comes into the Adams orbit through the diplomatic world. He is charming and confident and socially adept, and he makes an excellent impression on everyone, including, initially, both of Nabby's parents. John approves. Abigail approves at first with somewhat more reservation than John, because Abigail's assessments of character have always been more searching than John's first impressions. And there is something in Colonel Smith's easy confidence that triggers, very faintly, a caution she cannot yet fully justify. She suppresses the caution. Nabby is in love, genuinely it seems, and with the measured, sensible quality that is her mother's most visible inheritance. She is 21. The match is, on the surface, a good one. William Smith has prospects, has connections, has the kind of military reputation that carries social weight in the post-war world. Abigail gives her blessing with warmth that is entirely real, even as something very quiet, something she would not dignify with the word premonition, continues to register its small, unasked-for concern. The wedding takes place in London in June of 1786, a relatively modest ceremony attended by the small circle of American and British acquaintances the family has accumulated during the diplomatic years. Abigail watches her daughter married in a foreign city, far from the Massachusetts landscape that has shaped both of them, and feels the complicated thing that parents feel at such moments: the love, the pride, the release, and the particular sorrow of watching a child step out of the circle you have kept around them and into a life you cannot entirely protect them from. She is glad for Nabby. She is also quietly, already worrying. The years in London accumulate. Abigail visits theaters and exhibitions and the studios of artists, including the American painter John Singleton Copley, whose work she admires and whose company she finds genuinely pleasurable. She meets the political and literary figures who move through London society and forms opinions about all of them. Sharp, specific opinions, recorded in letters that manage to be both diplomatically careful and utterly honest about what she has actually observed. She develops strong views about British policy, about the state of the transatlantic relationship, about the prospects for the commercial treaty that John is failing to negotiate, about the general character of the British government and its attitude toward the republic it has been forced to recognize. She misses Massachusetts. This is the thread that runs beneath everything in the London letters, the persistent, undiminishing homesickness of a woman who has found Europe extraordinary and interesting and in many ways richly rewarding, and who would give most of it without hesitation for a morning in Braintree with the salt air coming off the bay and the familiar weight of her own house around her. She is not someone who has discovered that she is, at heart, a cosmopolitan. She has discovered that she is and has always been deeply American, not in the patriotic performance sense, but in the specific, rooted sense of a person whose character was formed by a particular place, and who carries that place inside her regardless of how far she travels from it. She writes to Mercy Warren and to her sister Mary with an ache for home that is not self-pity but is something very real. And she writes about America, about what it is and what it is trying to be, about its roughness and its promise, about the things that the European comparison reveals about both its deficiencies and its possibilities, with the perspective of someone who is seeing her country clearly for the first time because she is seeing it from a distance. Europe has given her this, at least. The distance that has cost so much has also, as distance sometimes does, clarified the view. John Quincy has returned to America by 1785 to finish his education at Harvard and begin the legal career that his parents have mapped out for him, with the careful ambition of people who understand that a son of John Adams will be judged against an exceptionally demanding standard and must be prepared accordingly. His absence is another layer of the European loneliness, another member of the family on the other side of the ocean, another voice present only in letters, another reminder of the particular cost that public life exacts from the private relationships that make life worth living. By 1787, it is clear that John's mission in London has accomplished as much as it is going to accomplish, which is considerably less than he had hoped. The commercial treaty, remains unnegotiated. The British government shows no meaningful interest in addressing the various outstanding issues between the two nations. The treatment of American shipping, the debts still owed by both sides from before the Revolution, the evacuation of British troops from frontier posts that the peace treaty required but that have not in fact been evacuated. John has pressed these issues with his characteristic combination of persistence and bluntness, and has received in return the polite stonewalling of a government that does not feel the urgency. He writes to the Congress requesting permission to come home. The Congress grants it. The long European sojourn, 6 years of separation followed by 4 years of proximity in the most extraordinary circumstances either of them has ever inhabited, is drawing to a close. Abigail begins, with characteristic efficiency, to prepare for departure. She organizes the household, settles the accounts, makes arrangements for the shipping of the goods and furnishings they have accumulated, says her goodbyes to the people she has come to know in London, and begins the process of reconstructing in her mind the shape of the life she left and to which she will shortly return. She has been away for 4 years. America has been changing in her absence, working through the difficulties of the post-war period, struggling with the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation, moving toward the Constitutional Convention that will take place in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. She has followed all of this from London through newspapers and letters, with the close attention she has always given to political developments. She has opinions about the Constitution being drafted, as she has opinions about everything. She believes in a stronger central government than the Articles of Confederation have provided. She believes that the Republic needs a framework capable of actual governance, capable of raising revenue and maintaining order and conducting foreign policy with the consistency and authority that the current arrangement makes impossible. She is, in this sense, a federalist before the term fully exists, and she will embrace the Constitution that emerges from Philadelphia with the enthusiasm of someone who has been watching, from across the ocean, the consequences of the existing arrangement's inadequacies. She sails for home in the spring of 1788. The Atlantic crossing this time is in the opposite direction, west toward Massachusetts, toward Braintree, toward the house and the air and the landscape that she has been carrying inside her for 4 years. She is still seasick. The ocean does not improve simply because one has crossed it before. But the sickness is easier to bear when the destination is home. She is 43 years old. She has spent 4 years in European courts, navigating social worlds of extraordinary complexity, with a composure and a competence that have been noted and admired, and that she is by now thoroughly tired of maintaining. She has seen Paris and London. She has stood before a king, and held her own against the most elaborate social machinery in the Western world. She has married off her daughter and worried about her sons, and thought with increasing clarity and longing about Braintree. She is going home. The ship moves west across the Atlantic. The days pass. The water changes. And one morning, cool, bright, the sky the particular blue of the North Atlantic in spring, the coastline of Massachusetts appears on the horizon. A dark line that gradually resolves into the specific beloved geography of the place where she was born and where she has always, wherever she has been, continued to belong. She stands at the rail and looks at it. After everything, after 6 years of widowhood and 4 years of courts, after Paris and London and the sea crossed twice in each direction, after the King and Franklin and Nabby's wedding and the negotiations that failed, and the letters that crossed the ocean in both directions like the threads of a life held together by language, after all of it, she is looking at Massachusetts. She does not write in the surviving letters about what she feels in this moment. Some things perhaps are too large for the page, or too simple, or too entirely personal to submit to the organizing intelligence that has always been her primary relationship with experience. She stands at the rail and she looks. And the coastline comes closer and the air changes, and she is almost home. Chapter 7. The Vice Presidency, 1788 to 1796. Chapter 7. The Vice Presidency. 1788 to 1796. There is something quietly ironic about returning home from the courts of Europe, only to discover that home has, in one's absence, become something rather more complicated than the place one left. Abigail Adams sails back to Massachusetts in the spring of 1788 expecting Braintree, The salt air, the plain farmhouse, the comfortable anonymity of a private life resumed after years of public obligation. What she finds instead is a country in the middle of reinventing itself, a husband whose career is about to take its most consequential turn yet, and a social world that is, with remarkable speed, constructing around itself the protocols and expectations of a republic that has never quite existed before and is not entirely certain how a republic is supposed to behave. She is home for barely a season before the shape of what is coming becomes clear. The Constitutional Convention has concluded in Philadelphia in September of 1787, producing a document that Abigail has followed from London with the intensity of someone who understands that the inadequacies of the Articles of Confederation are not theoretical problems, but practical ones, felt in the daily difficulty of governing a nation that cannot reliably tax itself, cannot enforce its treaties, and cannot speak with a single coherent voice to the European powers that Abigail has just spent 4 years attempting to navigate. She is for the Constitution. She is for it with the enthusiasm of someone who has watched, from a frustrating distance, what the absence of adequate central government actually costs in terms of diplomatic credibility and basic national function. The question of ratification is still being fought out in state conventions when she returns, and she follows it with the same close, analytical attention she has always given to political developments of consequence. She discusses it with John, who has his own strong views, and with the various people who move through their household in the weeks after the return, and her positions are specific and defended, not the positions of a woman deferring to her husband's judgment, but the positions of someone who has formed her own analysis and is prepared to explain it. John Quincy is at home during this period, newly graduated from Harvard, reading law in the office of Theophilus Parsons in Newburyport, beginning the slow construction of a legal career that neither of them entirely expects will remain merely a legal career. Charles and Thomas are also in Massachusetts, at various stages of their education, and there is a period in the autumn of 1788 when the family is, for the first time in years, more or less assembled in the same place, and Abigail experiences the ordinary domestic pleasure of this with an intensity that the years of absence have made anything but ordinary. Nabby is in New York with Colonel Smith, who has been appointed Secretary of the American Legation to Great Britain, and who is using his connections and his charm to establish himself in the post-war professional world. Abigail writes to Nabby with the steady, warm frequency of a mother who loves her daughter and is, with increasing clarity, not entirely at ease about the life her daughter is living. Colonel Smith's prospects, which appeared solid enough at the time of the marriage, are revealing themselves to be somewhat less substantial than they seemed. He is good at beginnings, at the establishment of connections and the impression of momentum, and less good at the sustained, unglamorous work of actually building something. Abigail sees this. She does not say it directly, not yet, because Nabby is married, and the marriage must be supported, and there is nothing to be gained by naming a problem that cannot yet be solved. But she sees it, and the seeing is a low, persistent worry that runs beneath everything else. The election of 1788 is, in practical terms, not an election in the ordinary sense. Everyone understands that George Washington will be the first president of the United States. This is not in question, has not been in question, is so thoroughly assumed that the actual casting of electoral votes is almost a formality confirming what everyone has already decided. The question of some interest is who will be vice president, and the answer, John Adams with the second highest number of electoral votes, is one that Abigail receives with the characteristic mixture of pride and apprehension that she has always brought to her husband's public advancement. She is proud. She believes in John's abilities with a conviction that has survived 30 years of close observation, which is the most rigorous test available. And she believes that the vice presidency, whatever its limitations, is a recognition of those abilities that he has earned and deserved. She is also apprehensive, because she has spent enough time in proximity to public life to understand what it takes and what it costs, and because she knows John well enough to know that the position of vice president, constitutionally limited, diplomatically secondary, presiding over a Senate whose debates he must observe without participating, is going to require from him a degree of patient restraint that is not, in the deepest sense, his natural mode. She is also apprehensive about money. The salary of the vice president is not generous, and the demands of the position are not modest. Living in the nation's temporary capital, first New York, then Philadelphia, maintaining the household appropriate to the second office in the Republic, participating in the social life that the position requires, all of this costs money that the salary does not adequately cover. She knows this from experience. She has spent 4 years in London watching the gap between diplomatic salary and diplomatic social expectation, and the vice presidency promises a version of the same problem in a domestic setting. She begins, from the moment the appointment is confirmed, to calculate how it can be managed. John goes to New York ahead of her, as so often, and Abigail follows in the summer of 1789, making the journey from Braintree to New York with the organized efficiency of someone who has learned through years of practice that the difference between a difficult journey and a catastrophic one is almost entirely preparation. She arrives in New York to find the city in the particular state of excited self-consciousness of a place that has recently and unexpectedly become important, everyone aware that history is being made, everyone slightly uncertain about how one is supposed to behave in the presence of history, everyone performing a version of significance that has not quite yet settled into natural ease. The house they take, Richmond Hill, a substantial property a little north of the city proper, is more impressive than anything the Adams family has occupied in Braintree, and considerably less impressive than what Abigail has observed in the European capitals. This is, she decides, appropriate. The Vice President of the United States should live in a manner that reflects neither the aristocratic excess of European courts, nor the false modesty of a republic pretending to have no ceremonial requirements at all. Republican dignity, she uses this phrase or versions of it in several letters of this period, is a real thing, and its maintenance is not vanity but civic responsibility. It is in this spirit that she approaches the great social question of the early Republic, which is more fraught and more consequential than it might appear to eyes accustomed to a later, more settled national culture. The question in its simplest form is this: how does a republic behave? How does it receive guests, conduct official entertainments, present its leading figures to the public and to foreign representatives, without either descending into the monarchical pomp it has explicitly rejected or dissolving into an informality that undermines the dignity a functioning government requires? There is no precedent. There is no protocol inherited from a previous American administration, because there is no previous American administration. Everything must be invented, and what is invented now will, by the nature of precedent, tend to persist. Abigail understands this with a clarity that makes her simultaneously one of the most important social architects of the early Republic and one of the most criticized women in it. Because establishing protocol requires making decisions, and making decisions requires taking positions, and taking positions invites opposition. And the opposition to Abigail Adams's positions, from those who find her standards too elevated, too European, too suggestive of the aristocratic tendencies that Republicans are supposed to have left behind, is neither quiet nor brief. She has allies in this project, and the most important of them lives at the other end of the social world of the early Republic, in the house of the President. Martha Washington is, in 1789, 60 years old, 17 years older than Abigail, a small, round woman of enormous composure and absolute social authority, who has been managing one of the largest plantations in Virginia, and serving as the First Lady of the Continental Army, and navigating the most demanding social circumstances of the Revolutionary period for decades. She is not an intellectual in the way that Abigail is an intellectual. She does not conduct political correspondence, or engage in the analysis of constitutional principles, or write letters that will last for centuries. But she is, in the domain they now share, the social establishment of the Republic's executive world, Abigail's equal in instinct and superior in experience. Their friendship, which begins in the formal context of official social obligations and deepens into something genuine across the years of the Washington administrations, is one of the more interesting relationships of the founding period, and one that is frequently overlooked in favor of the more dramatic connections, Adams and Jefferson, Hamilton and Burr, the great male rivalries and alliances that dominate the standard narrative. The friendship between Abigail Adams and Martha Washington is not dramatic. It is warm and practical, and based on mutual recognition between two women who understand in ways that their husbands perhaps do not fully appreciate what is actually required to hold the social world of the new republic together. Martha's Friday evening levees, the regular formal receptions at which the first family receives visitors, are the central social institution of the Washington administration, and Abigail attends them with a regularity and an attention that are both social duty and genuine study. She watches how Martha manages the room, the positioning, the greeting, the graceful movement of a hostess through a space filled with people of varying rank and varying temperament, and she takes notes mentally for the receptions she conducts at Richmond Hill and later at Bush Hill in Philadelphia. She asks Martha's advice about specific social situations, the kind of advice that can only be sought from someone who has navigated the same situations before and who will give a useful answer rather than a polite one. Martha, for her part, finds in Abigail something she has not always had in abundance in the social world of the early republic: a companion of genuine intelligence who takes the work they are both doing seriously and who can discuss it with the analytical precision it deserves. The social establishment of a republic is not a trivial undertaking. It is, in its way, as consequential as the constitutional debates, because the culture of a government, the way it presents itself, the values it embodies in its daily ceremonial life, the expectations it sets for the treatment of visitors, and the conduct of official business, shapes the actual character of governance in ways that are difficult to legislate but possible to cultivate. Martha understands this instinctively. Abigail understands it analytically. Together they understand it completely. The social world of New York in 1789 and 1790 is, by later standards, intimate. The entire governmental apparatus of the United States fits into a remarkably small collection of houses and meeting rooms, and the people who constitute the Republic's leadership class know one another personally, have dinner together, attend one another's levees, sit in the same pews at church, watch one another's children at play in the same small parks. This intimacy is one of the more extraordinary features of the founding period, and one of its more treacherous ones, because it means that every political disagreement is also a personal one, that every alliance and every rivalry is conducted between people who have to continue living in close proximity, regardless of what those alliances and rivalries require of them. Abigail navigates this world with considerable skill, and with the characteristic Adams liability of being rather more candid in her private letters than is always strictly advisable. She has opinions about everyone: the members of the Senate over which John presides, the members of Washington's cabinet, the various foreign representatives who circulate through the diplomatic social world, the leading figures of New York and Philadelphia society. These opinions are recorded in her letters to her sister Mary, to Mercy Warren, to John Quincy, with a vividness that is one of the great pleasures of her correspondence, and that has also occasionally created difficulties when letters have been shared or read by audiences beyond their intended recipients. She is, for instance, not entirely admiring of Alexander Hamilton, who is serving as Secretary of the Treasury, and whose financial program, the assumption of state debts, the establishment of a national bank, the cultivation of a manufacturing economy, she follows with attention and evaluates with a mixture of admiration for its ambition and concern about its implications. She finds Hamilton brilliant and she finds him dangerous, not because his intelligence is in question but because his judgment in certain areas is. She writes about this carefully, aware that Hamilton is important to the administration and to John's political world, but not carefully enough to avoid putting her assessment clearly on the record. She is considerably more critical of Thomas Jefferson, and this requires some attention, because in 1789 Jefferson is not yet the political opponent he will become. He is the Secretary of State, a founding figure of enormous reputation, a man whose intelligence Abigail has no reason not to respect. And she does respect it. She has in fact a history of warm interaction with Jefferson that predates the political divisions of the 1790s. When she and John were in London and Jefferson was the American minister in Paris, they exchanged letters of genuine warmth and intellectual engagement. She has liked him. She has found him charming and civilized and genuinely interesting. But she has also from the beginning found in Jefferson something that her particular moral intelligence finds troubling: an inconsistency, the same inconsistency she has been naming since the drafting of the Declaration, between the principles professed and the life lived. Jefferson speaks of liberty with an eloquence that is genuinely moving, and owns human beings with an ease that Abigail finds and has always found simply indefensible. She does not make this the constant subject of her correspondence on Jefferson during the vice presidential years. There are too many other things to discuss, but it is there, a consistent note of moral reservation beneath whatever else she says about him, and it will not diminish with time. The political landscape of the vice presidential years is one of rapidly accelerating division. The broad consensus of the constitutional moment, the shared commitment to making the new framework work, the general deference to Washington's presiding authority, is giving way, by the early 1790s, to a sharp and increasingly bitter polarization between two emerging factions. The Federalists, broadly, believe in a strong central government, a commercial and manufacturing economy, a pro-British foreign policy, and the maintenance of social order in deference to established authority. The Democratic Republicans, broadly, believe in the priority of the states, an agrarian economy, a pro-French foreign policy, and the radical democratic possibilities of the revolutionary moment. John Adams is a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is becoming the leader of the opposition. The friendship between the two men is beginning to strain, under pressures that neither of them is yet fully prepared to acknowledge. Abigail watches all of this with the alert, slightly sorrowful attention of someone who has been watching political friendships strain and break since the early days of the Revolution, and who has learned not to be entirely surprised when principle and alliance diverge. She is a Federalist by conviction. She believes in strong government, in order, in the maintenance of standards both social and civic, in the danger of the kind of radical democratic enthusiasm that the French Revolution is, during these years, making increasingly difficult to regard with simple admiration. The terror in France, the news of which reaches America in 1793 and 1794, confirms her in this conviction with a force that makes the confirming painful. She believed in the French Revolution's promise, and its collapse into violence is not satisfying to have predicted. She writes to John about the French situation with an anguish that is genuine. She has friends in Paris, people she met during the diplomatic years, and the news coming from France, the executions, the systematic destruction of the social and cultural fabric she observed firsthand is not abstract. It is specific people and specific places, consumed by a violence that she finds both comprehensible, as the product of decades of injustice and oppression, and terrifying, as the demonstration of what happens when the structures of civil order are removed and the passions of the crowd are given unchecked power. She is not surprised that a revolution built on the suppression of the many should produce rage when it breaks. But the rage has become something that she cannot endorse or excuse, and she says so clearly, in terms that will not endear her to those of her contemporaries, who continue to view the French Revolution through the uncomplicated lens of revolutionary solidarity. The family finances continue to require her active management throughout the vice presidential years. John's salary is insufficient for the demands of the position, and the gap is managed through the combination of the farm income from Braintree, which Abigail oversees from a distance, with the efficiency of long practice, and the careful continuous economy she maintains in the household, an economy that is real rather than performed, the economy of a woman who knows exactly what things cost, and exactly what can and cannot be afforded, and who makes those determinations without illusion or sentiment. She is frequently unwell during these years. The health problems that began in childhood have never entirely resolved, and the demands of the vice presidential years, the social obligations, the climate of Philadelphia, the stress of a political environment that is growing increasingly hostile, the persistent anxiety about children who are not all thriving, take a toll on a constitution that has always required more management than she generally acknowledges. She spends portions of several years back in Braintree recuperating, and these periods of enforced withdrawal from the social and political world are one she both resents and secretly requires. Resentful because she cannot bear to be absent from things that matter, grateful because the Braintree air and the familiar landscape do for her something that no physician can quite replicate. It is during one of these periods in Braintree that she receives the news she has been quietly dreading about Nabby. Colonel Smith's prospects have not improved. His financial situation is deteriorating in ways that are becoming impossible to conceal, And the marriage that Abigail blessed in London with warm and watchful enthusiasm is revealing itself to be exactly what her quietest instinct suspected: a match made with a man whose character does not quite sustain the weight placed on it. She does not write about this with anger. She writes about it with the measured, controlled sorrow of a mother who sees her daughter's difficulty clearly, and understands that there is very little she can do about it except be present, available, and unfailingly honest when honesty is sought. John Quincy has meanwhile been launched into his own public career with a combination of his father's influence and his own formidable abilities. He is appointed minister to the Netherlands in 1794, a posting that Abigail approves. It is the right level of responsibility for a man of his age and experience. It builds on the European knowledge he accumulated in childhood, and it keeps him productively occupied rather than sitting in Newburyport waiting for a legal practice to justify itself. She writes to him across the Atlantic with the same sustained, substantive engagement she has always brought to their correspondence, discussing politics, foreign affairs, his personal conduct, his professional prospects, treating him as the peer he is rapidly becoming while maintaining unmistakably the authority of the mother who shaped him. Charles worries her more. Charles has always worried her more, from the moment he came back from Europe unsettled and difficult, and unable to quite find his footing. He is in New York now, practicing law, and his practice is not flourishing, and there are signs, carefully not named in the family correspondence but present in the spaces between the words, of a difficulty with drink that Abigail cannot address directly because Charles will not receive the address, and because to name it is to make it real in ways that the family is not yet ready to make it real. She prays for him. She worries. She writes to him with the particular warmth she has always reserved for the child she cannot quite reach, and she does not yet know, because no one ever knows this in advance, how the story ends. By 1796, John Adams has served 2 terms as Vice President of the United States, a position that he has found more frustrating than fulfilling. The constitutional limits of the office, the requirement to preside without participating, the peculiar indignity of being second to a man whose greatness casts a shadow across everything done in its proximity. Washington has announced his intention to retire, and the political world has rearranged itself around the question of succession. John Adams is the Federalist candidate for the presidency. Thomas Jefferson, his old friend and deepening political opponent, is the Democratic-Republican candidate. The election of 1796 will be the first genuinely contested presidential election in American history, the first in which the outcome is not known in advance, the first in which 2 visions of what the republic should be are placed before the electorate and asked to compete. Abigail watches the campaign from Braintree, where she is managing her health and the farm, and the continuous correspondence that is her primary form of engagement with a political world she cannot formally enter. She is anxious about the outcome, not simply because she wants John to win, though she does, but because she believes, with the conviction of someone who has thought carefully about the alternatives, that the Federalist vision of governance is the right one for this moment, and that the Democratic-Republican alternative carries risks she finds genuinely alarming. She writes about this to John with the directness she has always brought to political subjects, and she writes about it to John Quincy and to her sister and to Mercy Warren, from whom she is, by this point, significantly politically diverged, Mercy having moved toward the Democratic-Republican position, with the same directness, undimmed by whatever social tension that directness creates. She does not, in these letters, address the other anxiety, the one she would not phrase as an anxiety, the one she keeps closely enough to herself that it does not appear often in the written record, but that is there nonetheless, in the logic of the situation, available to anyone who has been paying attention. The presidency, if it comes, will be different from the vice presidency. It will be different in scale, in demand, in the weight of what it requires. It will mean 4 more years, or possibly 8, of the public life that has been consuming their private one since before the Revolution. It will mean decisions of a consequence that the vice presidency has not required. It will mean enemies, real enemies, political enemies of the kind that the increasing bitterness of the partisan division is producing with frightening efficiency. She is ready. She is always ready, in the sense that she has never in her life declined to do what was required simply because it was difficult. But she is 51 years old, and she is sometimes tired, and the Braintree farmhouse has never looked more like the thing she would choose if the choosing were entirely hers. The choosing is not entirely hers. It never has been. This is the bargain, the same bargain she accepted 30 years ago in the Weymouth church, when she stood beside a young lawyer from Braintree and made promises that neither of them knew the full content of yet. She made them anyway. She has kept them. She will keep them still. The votes are counted. John Adams is elected the second President of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, with the second highest number of electoral votes under the original constitutional arrangement, becomes Vice President. An outcome of almost theatrical awkwardness that places the two men and their two visions of the Republic in a proximity that will resolve nothing and complicate everything. Abigail puts down the letter that carries this news and sits for a moment in the Braintree farmhouse, in the quiet that she has learned across a lifetime to use rather than merely endure. She thinks about what it means. She thinks about what it will require. She thinks about Martha Washington, who managed it with grace and competence, and who will soon be retiring to Mount Vernon, taking her experience and her friendship and her steady, practical wisdom out of the world Abigail is about to fully inhabit. Then she picks up her pen. There is so much to do. There is always so much to do. Chapter 8, Mrs. President, 1797 to 1801. They call her Mrs. President. Not always with admiration. The title, which attaches itself to Abigail Adams in the years of John's administration with the sticky persistence of a rumor, is meant by some as a compliment, an acknowledgement of the degree to which the second President of the United States is understood, by those who observe him closely, to be in genuine consultation with his wife on matters of consequence. It is meant by others as an accusation, evidence of undue female influence on the machinery of Republican governance, proof that the natural order of things is being violated in the executive mansion, wherever the executive mansion happens to be in a given year. It is meant by a substantial number of people simultaneously, as both things at once, the compliment and the accusation occupying the same three syllables. The admiration and the disapproval wound so tightly around each other that they cannot be separated without destroying both. Abigail receives the title with the composure she has always brought to being misunderstood at scale. She does not deny the influence. She would not be Abigail Adams if she denied the influence, and she has never in 50 years of life found false modesty a useful or an honest posture. She does not claim the influence in the formal sense either, because the formal claim would be both politically damaging and personally beside the point. She is not interested in credit exactly, not interested in recognition for its own sake. She is interested in the outcome. She is interested in what the Adams administration does and whether it does it well, and she is going to contribute to those outcomes through every channel available to her, which is to say through John, through the correspondence she maintains with key figures in the political world, and through the direct, unsparing counsel she has been giving her husband since before the Revolution made him consequential. The inauguration takes place on the 4th of March, 1797 in Philadelphia, in the chamber of the House of Representatives, and Abigail is not there. She is in Quincy. They have renamed Braintree, or the part of it that matters to the Adams family, in honor of Abigail's maternal grandfather, and the new name has settled over the old landscape with the slight unreality of all such civic rechristenings. She is in Quincy because she has been ill, because the winter journey to Philadelphia is more than her health can responsibly manage, and because the inauguration itself, the ceremony and the crowd and the formal transfer of power, is John's moment in a way that few moments have been or will be, and she has learned across a lifetime of supporting his public career to let him have his moments without requiring her presence in all of them. She reads the inaugural address from the newspapers. She finds it good. She has seen drafts, has, in the privacy of the weeks before, offered observations on the drafts that John has received, with the mixture of gratitude and mild defensiveness that characterizes his response to her editorial interventions, and the final version reflects both his best instincts and the careful shaping of someone who understands that an inaugural address is not merely a speech but a document, a statement of intention that will be measured against everything that follows. She is proud of it. She is proud of him, with the uncomplicated, unambivalent pride that sits alongside all the complicated, ambivalent things she feels about the situation and its demands. She arrives in Philadelphia in the spring, and the presidency begins in earnest. The world that John Adams inherits from George Washington is a world in crisis, though the crisis is not yet fully visible in all its dimensions. The relationship between the United States and France, the country to which America owes a debt of revolutionary solidarity, and with which it has maintained a treaty of alliance since 1778, has deteriorated sharply under the strains of American neutrality in the ongoing European wars. France, now in the radical phase of its revolutionary convulsions, regards American neutrality as a form of betrayal, a siding with Britain that violates both the letter and the spirit of the alliance. French warships are seizing American merchant vessels with increasing aggression, and the French government under the Directory is receiving American diplomatic overtures with contempt and hostility. The XYZ affair, which breaks publicly in 1797 and 1798, crystallizes the crisis into a scandal. 3 American diplomats, Pinckney, Marshall, and Gerry, have been sent to Paris to negotiate a resolution to the maritime conflict, and they have been met not with negotiation but with a demand: pay a bribe to the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand before any discussion can begin. The diplomats refuse. They report home. John Adams presents the correspondence to Congress with the names of the French agents replaced by the letters X, Y, and Z, and the country erupts. Abigail follows the XYZ affair with an intensity that is personal as well as political. She has been to Paris. She has met some of these people. She has formed, across the years of the diplomatic experience, a view of French political culture that has always included a sober assessment of its capacity for cynicism. And the XYZ demand confirms that assessment in the most unambiguous possible terms. She is furious, a controlled analytical fury, the kind that sharpens rather than obscures the intelligence, and she is also, in a more complicated way, sad, because the France she is watching descend into this combination of revolutionary violence and diplomatic corruption is the same France where she spent some of the most extraordinary months of her life, where she walked the boulevards and visited the palaces and formed friendships with people who are now, many of them, either dead or scattered or transformed beyond recognition by what the revolution has done. She writes to John about the French situation with the frankness of a close political advisor, which is precisely what she is. She believes that the quasi-war, the undeclared naval conflict that emerges from the XYZ crisis, fought on the Atlantic between American and French vessels, is necessary and justified. She believes that American sovereignty and American commerce must be defended with the force the situation requires. She supports the building up of the American Navy, which John pursues with the conviction of someone who understands that a republic with maritime commercial interests and no naval capacity to protect them is simply a republic with a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. She is also thinking, during this period, about the domestic implications of the foreign crisis, and it is here that her influence on the Adams administration becomes most visible and most controversial. Because the war fever generated by the XYZ affair produces, in its domestic political aftermath, a legislative response that Abigail Adams supports with an enthusiasm that her defenders find principled and her critics find inexcusable. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 are 4 pieces of legislation passed by the Federalist-dominated Congress in the atmosphere of quasi-war crisis. The Alien Acts extend the residency requirement for citizenship, give the President authority to deport aliens deemed dangerous, and allow for the detention of enemy aliens in wartime. The Sedition Act makes it a crime to publish false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the government, the President, or the Congress with the intent to defame them or bring them into contempt. Abigail supports the Sedition Act. This is the part of her record that is most difficult to reconcile with the rest of it, with the woman who argued for liberty and rights and the consistent application of principles, with the woman who wrote to John about remembering the ladies, with the woman whose moral compass has always pointed, through every political weather, toward the expansion rather than the contraction of human freedom. And it requires honest engagement rather than excuse, because the support is real and recorded and cannot be explained away. She supports it because she is frightened. This is the truest answer, and it is not a small truth. The political opposition to John's administration, the Democratic-Republican press, the newspapers aligned with Jefferson and his allies, has reached, by 1798, a level of personal vituperation that goes beyond anything she has previously experienced in a long experience of political combat. She is being attacked. John is being attacked. The attacks are not merely critical, they are, in her assessment, deliberately false, systematically malicious, designed not to inform the public but to destroy the administration's credibility and the Federalist cause with it. She has watched the press in France contribute to the atmosphere that produced the terror. She sees in the Democratic-Republican newspapers something that frightens her in a similar way: the deliberate mobilization of popular passion through deliberate distortion of fact. She is wrong in the judgment of history about what the remedy for this should be. The Sedition Act is a law that criminalizes political speech, and whatever the provocation that produced it, the criminalization of political speech is incompatible with the principles of free government that Abigail Adams has spent her life defending. The several editors and writers prosecuted under it, including Benjamin Franklin Batch, grandson of the man Abigail met in Paris, whose newspaper Aurora has been among the most ferocious critics of the administration, are prosecuted not for lying but for criticizing. And the distinction between malicious falsehood and vigorous opposition is not one that a government enforcing a sedition law is well positioned to draw with consistency. She knows this in some part of herself, even as she supports the act. There is a quality in her letters of this period when she discusses the prosecutions, a defensiveness, a slightly over-vehement insistence on the justice of the cases, that suggests she is arguing against an internal objection as much as against an external critic. She is not a woman who usually needs to insist. When she is sure of herself, she states and moves on. The slightly labored quality of the Sedition Act defenses is the quality of a woman working harder than usual to maintain a position that does not sit entirely comfortably with everything else she believes. She will not, in her lifetime, fully reckon with this contradiction. It will be left for others to reckon with on her behalf, and the reckoning is an honest part of the larger account of who she was, not an asterisk or a footnote, but a real part of the record of a real person who was capable of error in proportion to her capability for everything else. The household of the Adams presidency is managed by Abigail with the same relentless competence she has brought to every household she has ever run, elevated now to a scale that the Braintree farmhouse and the London legation could not have prepared her for, and that she manages anyway, because the scale has always been higher than the preparation, and she has always managed anyway. The President's house in Philadelphia is a substantial establishment requiring a substantial staff, and Abigail oversees it with an attention to economy and order that is occasionally criticized by those who find the household less lavish than the occasion seems to require, and occasionally criticized by those who find it more lavish than Republican simplicity should permit. She cannot satisfy both critics simultaneously, and she does not exhaust herself trying. Philadelphia is also where her health is most consistently difficult. The city in summer is, for Abigail Adams, something close to punishing. The heat, the humidity, the diseases that circulate through an 18th-century city, with the efficiency of a well-organized postal system, all of it combining to produce conditions in which she is frequently unwell. She spends substantial portions of the presidential years at Quincy, recovering, and the periods of recovery are not entirely unwelcome, because Quincy in summer has an air that Philadelphia cannot replicate, and a simplicity that the demands of the presidential household cannot accommodate. During these periods in Quincy, the correspondence between husband and wife takes on again the quality of the great separations, the letters of the Revolutionary War, the letters across the Atlantic. They write to each other about everything: the political situation, the family finances, the children, the management of the Quincy property, the state of John's health, the state of her own health, the ongoing dramas of an administration navigating between foreign crisis and domestic political war. The letters are still extraordinary. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the health, whatever the pressure, Abigail Adams writing to John Adams is one of the enduring literary and historical pleasures of the American founding period. The family provides its own continuous drama during these years. John Quincy is in Berlin, serving as American minister to Prussia, a posting that suits his abilities and his European formation, and that produces diplomatic work of real quality. He has married, in 1797, Louisa Catherine Johnson, the daughter of an American merchant in London, a woman of genuine intelligence and considerable beauty, and a temperament that is, in certain respects, the opposite of the Adams style, more fragile, more given to anxiety, more in need of the reassurance that the Adams family does not naturally produce in abundance. Abigail's relationship with her daughter-in-law is not simple. She finds Louisa delicate in ways that she, Abigail, is constitutionally unable to regard as anything other than a challenge to be overcome, and she does not always manage the finding with the tact the situation requires. The letters between the two women during this period have a quality of mutual wariness that will soften over time but never entirely disappear. Charles is in New York, and Charles is in serious trouble. The signs that Abigail has been watching with increasing alarm for years have resolved by 1798 and 1799 into something impossible to name as anything other than what it is. He is drinking. He is not managing his finances. His legal practice, such as it is, has effectively collapsed. His marriage, he has married a woman named Sally Smith, his brother-in-law's sister, is under the strain of a man who is disappearing into something his family cannot follow him into and cannot pull him out of. Abigail writes about Charles with a grief that is the most unguarded grief in her correspondence of these years, more unguarded than anything she writes about the political attacks, more raw than anything she writes about the Sedition Act or the French crisis. He is her child. He is lost. And there is nothing, for all her extraordinary capacity for solving problems, that she can do. John is less patient with Charles than Abigail is, or less willing to sustain the patience through the repeated disappointments. He is angry where she is grieving, and the anger is not without its own kind of love, but it does not help Charles, and it does not help Abigail, who must manage her husband's anger and her own grief, and the ongoing practical demands of the administration simultaneously. This is not a new skill. She has been managing multiple layers of difficulty simultaneously for her entire adult life, but it is a particularly heavy combination, and it shows in the letters of 1799 in a way that is new. The move to Washington is the great practical adventure of the final year of the administration. The new capital, carved out of the Maryland and Virginia countryside along the Potomac, designed by Pierre Charles L'Enfant with a grandeur that the actual construction has not yet approached, receives the Adams administration in November of 1800, and Abigail arrives to find a city that is, in the most literal and fundamental sense, unfinished. The President's House, the great white building that will eventually become one of the most recognized structures in the world, is habitable in the loosest sense of the term. The plaster on many of the walls is still wet. The staircases are incomplete. There are no bells to summon servants. The main audience room, what will eventually be the East Room, is so unfinished that Abigail does what any practical woman would do when confronted with a large unfinished room and a household's worth of laundry. She hangs the washing there to dry. She writes about the President's house to her daughter Nabby, with a combination of humor and exasperation that is one of the more charming pieces of writing she produces during the presidential years. She notes the grandeur of the concept, and the gap between the concept and the current reality, with the dry precision of a woman who has managed enough households in enough conditions to know that a house is what you make of it, rather than what the architect intended. She admires the setting, the Potomac, the surrounding landscape, the sense of space and possibility, even as she catalogues the considerable deficiencies of a residence that is requiring her to improvise solutions to basic domestic problems that should have been addressed before anyone moved in. She is practical about Washington in the same way she has been practical about everything, assessing the situation honestly, identifying what can be done with what is available, and doing it without waiting for the circumstances to improve of their own accord. She establishes the household routine with the efficiency of long practice. She holds the receptions and levees that the presidential social calendar requires. She receives visitors and manages the staff, and maintains the decorum of a presidential household in conditions that would have defeated someone with less experience of difficulty, as simply the normal weather of her life. The political situation in the final year of the administration is one of accelerating crisis. The election of 1800 is underway, the rematch between Adams and Jefferson, now conducted in a partisan atmosphere so embittered that the newspapers of both sides have abandoned any pretense of objectivity, and are conducting something closer to warfare than to journalism. Abigail reads the opposition press with a comprehensive fury that she documents in her letters with remarkable specificity, citing particular articles and particular allegations and particular lies. She calls them lies unambiguously, which is the word she has settled on for the systematic distortions of political journalism in the late 1790s, and refuting them with the precision of a woman who knows the facts and is not going to pretend otherwise simply because the pretense might be more comfortable. She is also dealing, through the autumn of 1800, with the knowledge that Charles is dying. He is 30 years old. The years of drinking have done what they do, with the terrible efficiency of addiction, and Charles Adams in the autumn of 1800 is a man whose body has given way to what his spirit could not withstand. Abigail goes to New York to see him, this son who has cost her more sleep and more prayer and more quiet grief than she has ever fully expressed in any letter, and she sits with him in the way that mothers sit with children who are leaving, with the full presence that is the only thing left to offer when everything else has been tried and failed and tried again. Charles dies in November of 1800. He is 30 years old. He dies in the same month that the election returns are coming in, and the future of the administration is being determined. And Abigail carries both of these things at once, the private grief and the public uncertainty, in the way she has always carried multiple enormous things, which is to say without public collapse, without the visible drama of a woman overwhelmed, but with a cost that is registered in the letters of the weeks that follow in something quieter and more enduring than tears. The election of 1800 produces one of the more remarkable constitutional crises of the early republic. Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both Democratic-Republican candidates, Jefferson for president, Burr for vice president, received the same number of electoral votes due to the original constitutional arrangement, which does not distinguish between votes for president and vice president. The election is thrown to the House of Representatives, where it will be resolved after 36 ballots and a period of genuine constitutional uncertainty in Jefferson's favor. John Adams is not re-elected. The Federalists have lost. John leaves Washington before the inauguration, before Jefferson takes the oath, in the early morning hours of March 4, 1801, and the departure has been argued about ever since, characterized by his political opponents as petulance, characterized by his defenders as the entirely reasonable decision of a man who sees no purpose in attending the public celebration of his own defeat. Abigail has already left the city. She went to Quincy in February, managing the practical business of the transition, arranging the household that must be reconstituted in Massachusetts, doing what she has always done, which is to prepare carefully and thoroughly for whatever comes next. She is 56 years old. She has been First Lady of the United States for 4 years, and the wife of the Vice President for 8 years before that, and a farmer's wife and a revolutionary's partner and a diplomat's companion, and a mother and a manager and a thinker and a writer and an advisor and an advocate for 37 years before that. She has run a farm and a legation, and a presidential household, and an argument for the rights of women, and an argument against slavery, and an argument for the consistent application of principles in a world that prefers its principles applied conveniently. She is going home to Quincy. She is leaving the president's house with its wet plaster and its laundry and its magnificent unfinished grandeur behind. The presidency is over. John will not seek it again. The public life that has consumed the private one for 30 years is concluding, and what remains is the farm and the letters and the long, quiet, finally private days of an old age that neither of them has quite known how to imagine, so thoroughly have they been occupied with everything else. But she is not finished. She is never, while she is breathing, entirely finished. The letters will continue. The thinking will continue. The opinions, sharp and clear and entirely her own, will continue to form and be expressed, and be sent out into a world that has not always known what to do with them but has never been able to ignore them. She is Mrs. President. She has always known that the title, for all its ambiguity, is not wrong. She is going home. Chapter 9. Personal Sacrifices, 1801–1813. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows a long noise. Not the silence of emptiness, nothing so simple or so clean, but the silence of aftermath, of a life that has been conducted at full volume for so long that the cessation of noise is itself a kind of sound, something the ears must adjust to, something the body must learn to inhabit without the familiar vibration of public purpose to organize the days around. Abigail Adams returns to Quincy in the winter of 1801, and finds this silence waiting for her, patient and absolute, in the house and the fields, and the particular quality of the Massachusetts light that has been through everything, the constant backdrop of her inner life. She is 56 years old. John is 65. They are old by the standards of their time, not ancient, but old enough that the body has begun to make its own commentary on the years it has been asked to carry, old enough that the morning takes longer to negotiate and the cold settles more deeply, and the list of people one has loved and lost has grown to a length that requires a different kind of accounting than the living list does. They are home, finally and completely, in a way they have not been home since before the Revolution made the word home mean something different from a physical address. The house at Peacefield, the name they have given the Quincy property, with the slightly wistful romanticism of people who have spent many years in places where peace was not the prevailing condition, is comfortable without being grand, familiar without being small. John has made improvements over the years, additions to the original structure that reflect both the expanding family's needs and the requirements of a household that has, periodically, hosted the business of the Republic. There are books everywhere, in the way that a house gradually fills with books when the people who live in it have been reading voraciously for 6 decades. There is a garden, which Abigail tends with the same systematic attention she brings to everything, moving through it in the early mornings with the deliberateness of someone who has learned that the natural world does not respond to urgency and has made her peace with moving at its pace. She has not made her peace with retirement in any larger sense. This is clear from the first weeks, from the letters she writes, from the newspapers she reads, from the quality of attention she brings to the political developments unfolding in the Jefferson administration, which she follows with the alert, critical engagement of an opposition party of one. She has not retired from thinking. She has not retired from writing. She has retired from the social and ceremonial demands of public life, which is a relief of dimensions she had not fully anticipated, but the interior life, the life of analysis and opinion, and the continuous restless engagement with the world and its conduct, shows no sign of concluding simply because the formal obligations have. She establishes a rhythm at Quincy that is, in its way, the first rhythm of her life that has been chosen rather than imposed by circumstance. The mornings are for letters and reading. The household requires its management as it always has, and she manages it with the efficiency of long practice, though the scale is reduced from the presidential years and the reduction is welcome. There are grandchildren, Nabby's children and eventually John Quincy's and Thomas's, who visit and stay, and bring the noise and energy of the young into a house that might otherwise settle too deeply into the quiet of late life. She loves the grandchildren with the uncomplicated warmth that grandmotherhood permits, the love without the full weight of responsibility, the pleasure without the anxiety, or rather with an anxiety reduced to a manageable level by the one remove of generation. John is her companion in these years in a way that he has not been, not continuously, and not without the pressure of public obligation, since the earliest years of their marriage. They talk. They argue. About Jefferson, about the direction of the Republic, about theology and philosophy and the state of Massachusetts and the behavior of their neighbors, with the easy, practiced pleasure of two people who have been arguing with each other for 40 years, and have long since established that argument is not a sign of discord but its opposite, the most intimate form of engagement available to two minds of their particular character. She finds him, in old age, easier to be with than he was in the urgency of public life, the roughest edges of his temperament softened by time and the removal of the pressures that most reliably sharpened them. She also finds him in moments heartbreaking. Because John Adams in retirement is a man who has not entirely found his way to peace with the outcome of 1800, who carries the defeat and the estrangement from Hamilton and the dissolution of the Federalist coalition as wounds that have not fully closed, and who tends in the evenings and in the longer quiet stretches of the retired life to return to these wounds with the attention that prevents rather than promotes healing. She watches this, and she manages it as she has always managed his difficult emotions, with the combination of genuine sympathy, firm redirection, and the occasional blunt statement of a truth she believes he needs to hear whether or not he wishes to hear it. But the first great sorrow of the Quincy years is not John's defeat. It is a sorrow that arrives before she has fully settled into the rhythm of retirement, that arrives in fact in the last weeks of the administration, in November of 1800, and that she has carried from Washington to Quincy in the way one carries a wound that has not yet been given the space to be fully felt. Charles is dead. He has been dead since November, and she has been carrying this, through the final weeks of the administration, through the packing and the departure, through the long journey back to Massachusetts, with the compressed, disciplined grief of a woman who has learned across a lifetime that grief, like everything else, must be managed, must be given its time and its space without being permitted to overwhelm the other obligations that do not pause for it. She has not permitted the overwhelm. But now in Quincy, with the obligations reduced and the silence larger, the grief finds its full dimensions. Charles was 30 years old. He was the second son, the middle child in temperament as well as in birth order, more sensitive than John Quincy, more volatile than Thomas, possessed of a warmth and a charm that his brothers lacked, and that made his decline all the more devastating to watch, because the warmth was real and the charm was real, and the person being consumed by the addiction was a genuinely lovable person, not a cautionary abstraction, but a child she held and fed and worried over and prayed for across 30 years of specific, irreplaceable days. She does not write extensively about Charles in the months after his death. This is characteristic. She has always been most reticent about the losses that cost her most, as if the depth of the grief places it beyond the reach of even her extraordinary capacity for language, or as if putting it fully into words would make it final in a way that the unwritten version is not. She mentions him. She refers to him in letters where his name comes up in other contexts, family discussions, practical matters, the situation of his wife Sally and his children, who must now be provided for in the absence of the man who is supposed to provide for them. She does these things with the practical attention that has always been her response to difficulty. But the full reckoning with what the loss of Charles means to her, that is kept somewhere interior, somewhere that the letters do not quite reach. What the letters do reach, and with increasing frequency in the years after 1801, is the political world she has nominally retired from. Because the Jefferson administration provides Abigail Adams with a sustained occasion for the kind of critical engagement that is, for her, not a choice, but a constitutional necessity. She disagrees with Jefferson on nearly everything, on the proper role of the federal government, on the relationship between the United States and France, on the dismantling of Federalist appointments and policies, on the general philosophical orientation of a presidency that she believes is governing by sentiment and popularity rather than by the sober assessment of what the Republic actually requires. She is particularly exercised by Jefferson's removal of John Quincy Adams from his position as Commissioner of Bankruptcy in Massachusetts. A small appointment, not central to John Quincy's career, but a removal that Abigail reads as a political act of petty vindictiveness, the new administration demonstrating its power by erasing the marks of the old one wherever they can be found. She writes about this to various correspondents with a controlled fury, that is, by the standards of her correspondence, about as close to uncontrolled as she gets. And then in 1804, something unexpected happens. Abigail and Thomas Jefferson begin to correspond. The occasion is the death of Jefferson's daughter, Polly Jefferson, whom Abigail knew in London, a girl she cared for briefly when Polly passed through on her way to join her father in Paris, a child who lodged in Abigail's heart in the way that certain children do, through some combination of need and sweetness that makes the adult who encounters them feel the full weight of protectiveness. Polly has died at 25 of complications following childbirth, and Abigail writes to Jefferson with the condolence of someone who genuinely grieves the loss, and who has enough history with Jefferson, enough years of warm acquaintance before the political rupture, to write to him as a person rather than as an adversary. Jefferson responds, and what follows is one of the more remarkable and finally doomed epistolary exchanges of the period. A correspondence between two people who like each other and disagree with each other profoundly, who are both intelligent enough to engage genuinely, and both principled enough to be honest about the disagreement, and who discover over the course of several months of letters that the disagreement is too fundamental and the wounds too specific to be resolved by warmth and good intentions, however real those warmth and intentions are. Abigail writes to Jefferson about the Sedition Act prosecutions with the characteristic honesty that makes her, at her best, such a reliable witness to her own positions. She defends the administration's conduct. Jefferson disputes her characterization. She challenges his dismissal of the Federalist judiciary, his removal of judges appointed by John, which she reads as a violation of judicial independence. He justifies the removals on grounds she finds insufficient. They go back and forth with a precision and a passion that makes the correspondence genuinely gripping, and that ultimately reveals that the gulf between them is too wide to be bridged by two people writing letters, however intelligent the people and however careful the letters. Jefferson eventually writes to John, asking him to mediate. John declines, not unkindly, but the correspondence between Abigail and Jefferson ends without resolution. It is not quite a rupture, there is too much mutual respect for that, but it is a recognition that some distances are real and do not yield to the will to close them. She files this away with the other recognitions of a lifetime, that people she loves can be wrong in ways she cannot excuse, that principle and affection do not always point in the same direction, that the complexity of political life is not separate from the complexity of human life, but is simply one of its most demanding expressions. John Quincy's career continues to develop in ways that give Abigail both pride and anxiety in equal measure. He has returned from Berlin to Massachusetts, has been elected to the United States Senate in 1803 as a Federalist, and is conducting himself in that body with an independence of mind that is admirable and politically inconvenient in equal proportion. He votes with the Jefferson administration on the Louisiana Purchase, a decision that his Federalist colleagues find indefensible and that Abigail finds, she will not quite say admirable, because the purchase represents an expansion of Jefferson's constitutional authority that troubles her in principle, at least defensible, the decision of a man thinking about the long-term interest of the Republic rather than the short-term interest of his party. He will eventually be effectively expelled from the Federalist Party for his independence, and will begin the transition toward democratic republicanism that will define his later career. Abigail watches this with the complex feelings of a mother who has raised her son to think for himself, and must now accept that thinking for himself produces conclusions she does not always share. She is proud of his integrity. She does not always agree with his conclusions. She maintains both positions simultaneously, as she has always maintained multiple complicated positions simultaneously, and she writes to him about the politics with the directness of a peer and the love of a mother, and the combination is entirely her own. Louisa Catherine, John Quincy's wife, is a more frequent presence in Abigail's life during these years as the family settles back in Massachusetts, and the relationship between the two women is one of the ongoing negotiations of the Quincy years. Abigail finds Louisa delicate in ways that she finds difficult not to interpret as a kind of failure, because Abigail's experience of life has not produced a framework for understanding that fragility and inadequacy are not the same thing, that a woman can be sensitive without being weak and struggling without being defeated. She is not unkind to Louisa. She is never unkind in the cold sense, but she is demanding in ways that Louisa finds, understandably, difficult to meet, and the demands are not always accompanied by the acknowledgement that they are extraordinary. Louisa will write about Abigail later in her own memoirs, with a candor that is both respectful and honest, about the difficulty of being John Quincy Adams's wife in the household and the shadow of Abigail Adams. The portrait she draws is of a woman of formidable intelligence and equally formidable expectations, a woman who is entirely without malice and entirely without the ability to make the space around her comfortable for someone who does not share her particular combination of capacity and resilience. It is, in its way, one of the more accurate portraits anyone ever draws of Abigail. Accurate precisely because it is drawn from the position of someone who felt the full weight of what that formidable intelligence required of the people in its vicinity. The years between 1801 and 1810 have a texture that is different from everything that preceded them, quieter in some ways, more internally complex in others, the drama less public and more personal, the crises domestic rather than national. There are good harvests and difficult ones. There are grandchildren's illnesses and recoveries, and the small emergencies of extended family life that require Abigail's organizational intelligence as reliably as any of the larger historical occasions. There are letters, always letters, the correspondence maintained with an energy and a breadth that makes it clear that retirement has not diminished either the appetite for intellectual engagement or the network of relationships that engagement requires. And there is Nabby. Nabby Adams Smith, Abigail's firstborn, the dark-eyed girl who traveled with her mother through the streets of London and stood beside her at the British court and grown into a woman of quiet composure and steady affection, has been living since the return from Europe, the difficult life that Abigail's earliest instinct about Colonel Smith predicted. William Smith has proven across the years of the marriage to be exactly what that faint early alarm suggested. A man of genuine personal charm and spectacular financial unreliability, given to grand schemes that promise transformation and produce catastrophe, to investments that evaporate and debts that accumulate, and the particular domestic disruption of a household managed by a woman of her mother's quality and undermined by a man of her husband's limitations. Nabby has endured this with a stoicism that is recognizably her mother's, and with a private grief that is entirely her own. She has not complained, not loudly, not in terms that would have required Abigail to respond with more than the steady, warm support she has always offered. She has managed. She has raised her children, 4 of them born across the years of the marriage, with the competence and the love that are her most clearly maternal inheritances. She has maintained her dignity in circumstances that would have stripped a less resolute person of it. And she has done all of this with a body that, it will become clear in 1811, has been harboring something that no amount of resolution can manage. The discovery of the tumor in Nabby's breast arrives in Abigail's correspondence in 1811, with the directness that medical realities require and that Abigail's correspondence has always honored. Nabby has found a lump. It has been examined. The examination produces a conclusion that the language of the time describes in terms that are clinical and precise, and that carry, beneath the clinical precision, the full weight of a mother's terror. Abigail responds to the news, as she has responded to every crisis of her life, with the immediate practical focus of someone who believes that action is always preferable to paralysis, that the appropriate response to a terrible situation is to identify what can be done and do it without delay. She writes to the best medical authorities available. She consults. She researches, reads everything she can find about the condition, about treatments, about outcomes. She brings to this the same analytical thoroughness she has brought to political crises and financial crises, and the management of farms in wartime, because it is for her a crisis of the same order, one requiring clear thinking and decisive action, and the refusal to be undone by the fear that is in this case entirely justified. The medical consensus in 1811 is that surgery is the treatment. Not the delicate anesthetized surgery of a later century, but the surgery of Abigail's time, performed without anesthesia, with the tools and the techniques available to early 19th century medicine, by a surgeon who is skilled by the standards of his era and who is about to perform one of the more barbaric procedures that those standards permit. A mastectomy. In a bedroom. Without anesthesia. On Abigail's firstborn child. Nabby undergoes the surgery in the autumn of 1811, in her home in New York with her husband present. Colonel Smith is not, whatever his financial failings, absent in this moment, and with the knowledge that her mother in Quincy is thinking of her with the full force of everything Abigail Adams has ever felt for anything. The surgery is performed by Dr. John Warren, and it is, by the account that reaches Abigail, an ordeal of a kind that the word ordeal barely encompasses. Nabby survives it. She endures it with a courage that the doctor finds remarkable, and that Abigail, receiving the account in Quincy, reads with a pride and a grief so interwoven that they cannot be separated. The surgery is believed, for a time, to have been successful. There is a period of months, through the winter of 1811 and into 1812, when the family allows itself something carefully short of hope, the guarded, provisional optimism of people who have been given a reason to believe in recovery without being given any guarantee of it. Nabby recovers from the surgery. She regains her strength. She writes to her mother with the composed warmth that has always characterized her letters. And the letters are the letters of a woman determined to be well, which is not the same as a woman who is well, but which is for a period close enough that the distinction can be set aside. It cannot be set aside indefinitely. By 1813, it is clear that the surgery has not accomplished what it was hoped to accomplish. The cancer has returned, or has never fully left, has been present through the months of cautious recovery in some form that the medicine of the time cannot detect and cannot address. Nabby, who has endured the surgery and the recovery, and the hope and the slow withdrawal of that hope with the same quiet resolution that has always defined her, is dying. She comes home to Quincy in the summer of 1813. This is the decision she makes, or the decision that is made. The distinction matters less than the outcome, which is that Nabby Adams Smith comes back to the house where she was born, to the mother who carried her into the world in the hot summer of 1765, and she dies there in July of 1813, 48 years old, in the farmhouse in Quincy with the salt air coming through the windows and the sound of the Massachusetts summer around her. Abigail is 68 years old. She has buried a child before, the brief, terrible life of Susanna 45 years ago, and she has buried Charles 13 years ago, and she has outlived enough of the people she has loved to know that the arithmetic of a long life is not only accumulation but loss, that the ledger has 2 columns and the second one fills with time. She knows this. She has always known this. The knowing does not make it smaller. She does not collapse. She never collapses. This is both her greatest strength and one of the more demanding aspects of being in her vicinity, the way she absorbs the unsurvivable and continues. She tends to the funeral arrangements with the practical attention that she has always given to practical things, because practical things must be attended to, regardless of the condition of the heart. And she has learned across a lifetime that the attending is itself a form of love, a form of honor, the last service that can be rendered to the person who no longer requires any other kind. And then she sits with it. The loss of Nabby. The loss of Charles. The loss accumulated across a decade, of friends and contemporaries who have been the furniture of her intellectual and emotional world. Mercy Warren, with whom she has been partly reconciled after the political divergence of the 1790s, but with whom the old closeness has never fully returned, and who dies in 1814. Others one by one, the names coming to her in the course of correspondence that brings news she does not want, and that she must receive anyway, because the alternative is to stop receiving the world, and she is not yet ready for that. She is not ready for that. This is the essential fact of Abigail Adams at 68, at the end of a decade that has taken from her more than she expected to be asked to give: her son, her daughter, the active political life that was the medium through which her intelligence found its most sustained expression, the health that has been precarious since childhood, and that is more precarious now. She is not ready to stop. She is tired and she is grieving, and she is more mortal than she has previously been required to acknowledge, and she is not ready to stop. The letters continue. John is beside her, old and sometimes difficult and entirely necessary, the one remaining constant in a life from which so many other constants have been removed. They sit together in the evenings in the house at Peacefield, with the books and the fire and the long habit of each other's company, and they talk about everything. About the grandchildren and the farm and the political situation, and the books they are reading and the people they have loved and lost, and the nature of the world and what in the end one is supposed to make of it. She is making of it everything. She has always made of everything. She is thinking and writing and managing and persisting, with the same fundamental orientation toward life that has characterized her since the small, sickly girl in Weymouth discovered what a book could do for a mind that was ready for it. The orientation has not changed. Only the landscape has. The cast of the light at the end of an afternoon, the particular quality of silence in a house that has been full and is less full than it was, the weight of the losses that she carries forward because the carrying forward is the only direction available to the living. She carries them. She has always carried everything. She is Abigail Adams, and she is not finished yet. Chapter 10, The Sage of Quincy, 1813–1818. The years after 70 carry their own particular stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, but of depth, the quiet of a lake whose surface barely moves because everything of consequence has long since settled into its waters. By 1813, Abigail Adams had become such a lake. She had lived through revolution, through the birth of a republic, through the agony of political defeat, and the long return to private life. She had buried children and outlived enemies. She had written more letters than most women of her era had read. And now, in the weathered farmhouse at Peacefield in Quincy, Massachusetts, with the smell of salt air drifting in from the harbor and the old elm trees casting their long shadows across the yard, she sat at her writing desk and continued to do what she had always done. She wrote. She thought. She watched the world with those clear, discerning eyes, and she shaped it still, in ways that few would fully appreciate until long after she was gone. The house itself had aged gracefully alongside her. Its rooms were filled with the accumulated weight of a life extraordinarily lived, portraits and pamphlets, letters tied with ribbon, books thumbed to softness at their spines. John moved through those rooms with the slower gait of an old man, but his mind remained restless, argumentative, full of fire. They had been together now for nearly 5 decades, and the texture of their companionship had changed in the way that long marriages do, less passionate in its surface expressions perhaps, but deeper at its roots. They finished each other's sentences. They argued the same arguments they had always argued, but with a kind of fond ritual to them now, like old songs sung in a familiar key. And then, in the winter of 1813, something arrived that Abigail had not quite anticipated. A letter. From Monticello. It had been more than a decade since John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had spoken. Their falling out was the stuff of political legend. 2 founding fathers, once the closest of collaborators, separated by the bitter partisanship of the 1790s and the brutal presidential campaign of 1800. John had felt betrayed. Abigail, for her part, had felt it even more personally. She had loved Jefferson once, had admired his mind, his grace, his tender friendship. She had visited him in Paris, had broken bread at his table, had trusted him as one trusts the rare few in a lifetime. And then she had watched him stand aside while his supporters tore her husband to pieces in the press, watched him smile his quiet smile while the machinery of his ambition ground forward. The wound had not entirely healed. But Benjamin Rush, that tireless, warm-hearted Philadelphia physician, who had served the Revolution with his pen and his medicine bag alike, had never stopped believing that the friendship between Adams and Jefferson could be restored. He had written to both men, coaxing and cajoling, pointing out that history would judge harshly any republic whose founders died estranged. And so, tentatively, almost shyly, John had written to Jefferson. Jefferson had written back. And what began as a cautious exchange of pleasantries gradually deepened into one of the great epistolary friendships in American literary history. Abigail watched this correspondence unfold from the periphery, and her feelings were complicated. She had, in fact, written to Jefferson herself several years earlier in 1804, when his daughter Polly had died. Abigail had known Polly, had cared for her as a child in London when Jefferson could not come to collect her himself. The grief of a child's death was something Abigail understood in her bones, and she had reached out across the political divide with that grief as her bridge. What followed was a remarkable if painful exchange of letters, honest and charged with old hurts, in which both she and Jefferson had laid out their grievances with a frankness that was almost startling. Neither had entirely satisfied the other. They had parted in a sense on civil but unresolved terms. Now, nearly a decade later, watching John's friendship with Jefferson bloom again through the post, Abigail found herself drawn back in. Not as a wounded woman, not as a partisan, but as something she had always been most essentially, a participant in the great conversation of her age. She began to write. Her letters to Jefferson during these years carry a quality distinct from her earlier correspondence with him. The sharpness is still there. Abigail was never one to sand down her opinions into comfortable vagueness. But there is also something warmer, more reflective, the way an autumn afternoon can be simultaneously crisp and golden. She wrote about books, about philosophy, about the nature of government and the prospects of democracy. She wrote about her grandchildren and her garden, and the peculiar satisfaction of watching the world continue to turn. And she wrote occasionally about the past, not to relitigate it but to understand it, to place it in some larger frame of meaning that old age and only old age makes possible. Jefferson, for his part, responded with his characteristic elegance. His letters were beautifully composed, layered with classical allusion and gentle wit. But Abigail was not intimidated by beauty or elegance. She had never been intimidated by anything, and she replied to his ornate sentences with her own plain-spoken directness, and the contrast was somehow perfect, the two voices playing against each other like instruments in complementary registers. What they debated in these years was nothing less than the meaning of the American experiment. Was democracy truly possible? Could ordinary citizens be trusted with self-governance? What was the proper role of religion in public life? What did the revolution ultimately mean, not as an event but as a principle? These were not idle questions. The Republic was still young, still uncertain of itself. The War of 1812 had exposed its military fragility. The question of slavery, which both Adams and Jefferson discussed with a kind of anguished avoidance, cast its long shadow over everything, the great contradiction at the heart of a nation founded on human dignity. Abigail did not avoid it. She had never owned enslaved people, had always found the institution morally repugnant, and said so carefully but clearly, in ways that gently pressed against Jefferson's more evasive framings. But even as these great national questions occupied her pen, Abigail's gaze in these years was drawn with increasing tenderness toward the personal. And no subject occupied her heart more fully in this season than her eldest son. John Quincy Adams had always been the child most like her. Brilliant and driven, morally serious to the point of austerity, capable of great warmth, but armored against the world in ways that sometimes made him appear cold. He had grown up at remarkable speed, tutored by Revolution, shaped by diplomatic postings across Europe before he was old enough to shave. He had served as a senator, as a professor of rhetoric at Harvard, as minister to Russia. He had survived his own political disappointments with the same stubborn resilience that characterized his parents. And now, as the years of the Jefferson correspondence unfolded, it was becoming clear that John Quincy was moving toward the center of American political life in his own right. Abigail watched this with a pride she could barely contain. She wrote to him constantly, perhaps more than to any other correspondent in these years. Her letters to John Quincy are not the letters of a mother who has loosened her grip. They are the letters of a woman who has invested the full force of her intelligence and her values in another human being, and is watching that investment bear fruit. She advised him on diplomacy, on political alliances, on the management of public perception. She analyzed the personalities of the men he worked alongside. She warned him about ambition, not because she thought it wrong, but because she understood how easily ambition could corrode integrity, and integrity was the one thing she valued above all others. She also worried about him. John Quincy carried within himself a melancholy streak that had always alarmed her, a tendency toward darkness when things went badly, a severity in self-judgment that bordered on the punishing. She had seen it in him as a boy, and she saw it still in the letters he sent home from St. Petersburg, from Ghent, from all the cold and distant places where American diplomacy deposited him. She urged him, in those private maternal letters that have survived history's filtration, toward balance. Toward joy even, that difficult, elusive quality that the Adams family, for all its brilliance, had never found entirely easy to sustain. By 1814, John Quincy was serving as the lead American negotiator at Ghent, working to bring the War of 1812 to its conclusion. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December of that year, was a diplomatic triumph, and it transformed John Quincy's standing in the eyes of the nation. From Quincy, Abigail read the dispatches with a mother's complex mixture of relief and pride. Her boy, the boy she had sent to Europe at the age of 10, clutching his father's hand, sailing across an ocean toward a world of consequence, had helped to secure the peace of the republic she had helped to birth. The symmetry of it moved her deeply. The years between 1815 and 1817 saw John Quincy return home as perhaps the most distinguished diplomat in American history, and then accept appointment as Secretary of State under President James Monroe. It was the most powerful cabinet position in the government, and it placed him in direct proximity to the presidency itself. Abigail understood what this meant. The path her son was walking led to the highest office in the land. She had watched that office up close, had watched what it cost a man, what it demanded of a family. She did not shield her son from that knowledge. She gave it to him plainly, as she gave everything plainly, and let him decide what to do with it. Meanwhile, the letters to Jefferson continued. In the autumn of 1816, Abigail wrote to him about the education of women, a subject that had occupied her for her entire adult life. She had been making the argument since before the Revolution. She had made it to John in those famous early letters from Braintree, had woven it into her observations on European schools, had pressed it on her daughter and her daughters-in-law and any young woman willing to listen. Education, she believed, was not ornament. It was not a finishing quality to make a woman better company at dinner. It was the foundation of genuine personhood, the thing that allowed a woman to think for herself, to judge, to contribute. A nation of educated women, she argued, would produce better men, better citizens, a stronger republic. Jefferson, who had his own complicated views on the matter, responded with characteristic grace and characteristic evasion. Abigail pressed the point gently, then let it rest. She had learned over a lifetime when to press and when to plant a seed and walk away. Some arguments were not won in a letter. They were won in the accumulation of years, in the example of a life lived according to their principles. Her health, which had been fragile for much of her middle age, had in some respects stabilized in her later years. She moved more slowly, tired more quickly, and the winters at Quincy had begun to carry a bite that she felt in her bones in ways she had not when she was young. But her mind remained luminous. Visitors who came to Peacefield in those years, and many came, for the house had become something of an informal court, a pilgrimage site for the Republic's thinking class, came away consistently astonished by the quality of her conversation. She was not performing for them. She was simply herself, which had always been the most remarkable thing she had to offer. She read voraciously, as she always had, history, philosophy, theology, the latest pamphlets from Boston and Philadelphia and Washington. She followed the political debates in Congress with the same attention she had given the Continental Congress 40 years before. She formed opinions and stated them. She kept faith with the Republic even when the Republic disappointed her, and it often did in these years, as factionalism reasserted itself and the dream of disinterested statesmanship seemed increasingly remote. But she did not become cynical. This perhaps is one of the most remarkable things about Abigail Adams in her final years, that she had seen so much, endured so much, understood the fragility of democratic institutions with such clarity, and still believed. Not naively, not without reservation, but with the considered earned faith of someone who had stood at the creation and given it her best self. In the quiet evenings at Peacefield, when John had retired to his study, and the house had settled into its nighttime rhythms, she would sit for a time by the window and look out at the Massachusetts dark. The same stars she had watched from Braintree during the Revolution, the same tide smell coming off the harbor. She had been a young wife then, frightened and determined in equal measure, raising children in the sound of cannon fire, writing letters that she was never quite certain would arrive. The world had changed beyond all recognition since those days. And yet, in some essential way, the questions were the same. How does a person live with integrity in a world that rewards expedience? How does a republic sustain itself when human nature is so reliably imperfect? What do we owe each other as citizens, as neighbors, as human beings sharing a brief moment on this difficult and beautiful earth? She had been asking those questions since she was a girl in Weymouth. She would be asking them in one form or another, until the very end. The end came, as it always does, without entirely sufficient warning. By the autumn of 1818, Abigail Adams was 73 years old. She had lived a life of almost incomprehensible fullness, had loved deeply, thought clearly, acted boldly, endured greatly. The typhoid fever came on in October, spreading through the household with the quiet efficiency of illness. She bore it with the same composure she had brought to every adversity. John sat beside her. Her children came. The house that had sheltered so much of American history held its breath. On October 28, 1818, Abigail Adams died. John Adams would outlive her by nearly 8 years, dying on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, within hours of Thomas Jefferson. But in those remaining years, John would say again and again to anyone who asked and to many who did not, that the greatest gift the Revolution had given him was not office, not fame, not even the Republic itself. It was the woman he had married in Weymouth in 1764. Her legacy in those final years and in all the years since has taken many forms. She is remembered for the letters, those thousands of remarkable documents that preserved not only the details of her own life, but the texture of an entire revolutionary age. She is remembered for her request that John remember the ladies, those 3 words that echoed forward across 2 centuries and more. She is remembered as a wife, a mother, the woman behind the man. But she was always more than that. She was, in her own right, one of the most formidable political minds of the founding generation. A woman who could not vote, could not hold office, was excluded by law and custom from every formal seat of power, and who nevertheless shaped the Republic as surely as any man who signed his name to its founding documents. She had done it with a pen. She had done it with a mind that refused to accept the limitations placed upon it. She had done it with a fierce, abiding love, for her husband, for her children, for the ungainly, improbable, magnificent experiment in self-governance that she had given her life to nurture. The sage of Quincy is gone now, these many generations past. But open her letters and she is there, alive in every sentence, pressing forward, demanding more, believing still. You have been listening to The Consort of Liberty, The Political Life of Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams remains a beacon of the American spirit, a woman who used her voice to bridge the gap between the world as it was and the world as it ought to be. Through her eyes, we have witnessed the birth of a nation, the struggle for consistent liberty, and the enduring power of a mind that refused to be silenced. Though her letters have come to an end, her plea to remember the ladies continues to challenge every generation to live up to the full promise of freedom.